Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy human being you, and welcome to today's true crime episode. I am so happy that you are here. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day-to-day, today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be having a true crime marathon. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. Now, with all that said, let's go ahead and get into this video. This is actually going to be the first little thing that I'm filming in 2025. If you've been here a while, you know that in January we had a little bit... Business as usual was not as usual. You know what I'm saying? But I'm trying to get back on track after this video. It's when we'll start with all new videos again. But this video is to serve for those of you, because I know there are some of you out there who do not like silence, right? You don't like to be alone with your own thoughts, which same. And so this video is just a long compilation of cases that have a like theme that are put together for you to watch, to put on while you do dishes, vacuum, if you have an earbud in, do laundry, or fall asleep too, because somehow some of you have said that my voice soothes you to sleep, which makes no sense, and my husband would heavily disagree with. But either way, if that's you, or if you just want a super long video of true crime to listen to, just keep on watching. Come, gather around, and let me tell you the story of the tragic murder of 22-year-old Tim McClean. To get started today, we're going to jump in our handy-dandy time machine, and we're going to be heading to July 30th, 2008 in Edmonton, Canada, which is a province of Alberta. This is where a 22-year-old Timothy Richard McClean Jr. was catching a bus from Edmonton to his hometown in Winnipeg, which is a province of Alberta. Now, Tim, he goes by Tim, had been in Edmonton because he was working as a carnival barker, which I had never heard that term before, but I had heard the term carny, and that's essentially what Tim did for a living. He worked for the carnivals. He would go with said carnivals, and he would be the guy who would stand out front, and he would yell at you, and he would entice you, and he would try to get the meat in the prospective seats. Prospective seats? Is it respective or prospective? He'd get your meats in the seats so you would watch the attractions and come to the carnival. That was his job. So he had been in Edmonton doing just that at a carnival. So anyways, Tim boarded the Greyhound Bus 1170 to Winnipeg, and it headed down the Yellowhead Highway through Saskatchewan, and it was going to be a long trip, about 13 and a half hours, so no short trip. So he chose a seat, and he nestled into a seat at the back of the bus near the bathroom and prepared for his long journey ahead. As is common with most bus trips, if you've never been on a bus before, because I know not everybody has, there are lots of stops along the way. It's not like one straight shot from location A to location B. So this bus had been driving along, making its usual stops for people to, new people to get on the bus, people to exit at their locations, people to have smoke breaks, etc., etc. And it was at this time, one of the stops they made was in a city called Erickson, which was also in the province of Manitoba. And this was only about 3 hours away from Tim's home in Winnipeg. So at this point, he had already been on the bus at least 10 hours, and this doesn't count the stops that they made to pick up more people and to take their smoke breaks, things like that. So it was definitely longer than 10 hours, but at least 10 hours. Can you imagine how exhausted you would be after a 10-hour bus ride? I ride the bus 2 hours to work every day. I cannot even imagine. That would be hell. Yeah. It was at this stop in Erickson that the bus picked up a new passenger. This was a man who appeared to be in his 40s, Asian Canadian. Remember where you are, Brittany. Remember where they are, Brittany. He appeared to be in his 40s. He had a shaved head, and he was wearing sunglasses. And this man's name was Vincent Wagwong Lee. So quickly, before we get into the details of that day, I want to tell you who these two men were. Now, there isn't a ton of information out there on Tim or Vincent, but I am going to tell you what I was able to deduce based on all the articles I read and the interviews, and give you an idea of who they were. So let's start, of course, with Tim. Timothy Richard McClean Jr. was born October 3rd, 1985 to parents Tim Sr., who clearly he was named after, and his mother Carol. And he was born in Victoria, British Columbia, and he was born into a big
immediate and extended family with several siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents. He had a lot of people in his life from the beginning who just adored him. He grew up in a smaller town about 40 minutes outside of the large city of Winnipeg, and it was called Elie, Manitoba, and this is where he lived when he was younger before settling down in Winnipeg, which is where he lived when he was tragically killed. Tim was a very active guy, a sports guy. He loved soccer, and he loved football, and he loved motorcycles. He generally just loved anything that would get him outside and into a little bit of trouble. Tim was seen as just a generally good person, a fun-time guy. I mean, he was a carny. I feel like that takes a very specific type of personality to be able to do and to be able to do well. And those who loved him said he could always bring out the best in people with his charm, and that he was a bit of a prankster, probably a bit of a pain in the ass, but in a good way, you know? At least that's how I picture him. His family didn't say that, I'm saying that. His family said that, quote, Tim's appetite was legendary, both for food and life, end quote. That he was just a guy who lived life to the fullest and could just never stand still. He was a man with wanderlust and just a vigor for life and seeing and experiencing the world around him. Tim's family said of him, and I quote, "From your first breath, you were loved beyond imagination. And although you were taken from us too quickly, we will never say goodbye. But for now, see you later." Ugh. Break my heart into a million pieces. Why don't you? Jesus Christ. That quote just hit me right there, you know? Sad. Now let's talk about the man who tragically murdered Tim McClean. And for literally no reason. If you haven't heard this case, it's gonna blow your mind because it's incredibly tragic. It happened for no reason at all. And it's really, really scary to think about, to be honest with you. Vincent Wagwong Lee, or Vince, as he was referred to by those who knew him, was born on April 30th, 1968 in Dandong, China, and he immigrated to Canada in 2001 before becoming a Canadian citizen in 2006. Prior to coming to Canada, Vince had graduated from the Wuhan Institute of Technology with a bachelor's degree in computer science, and once he had graduated, he got a job as a software engineer. Vincent had issues with his mental health as long as he lived in Canada, and presumably before that as well, considering how serious his mental illness had become. Though I do know that it can be triggered later in life, I just imagine that he may have had some episodes in China as well, though I did not see that reported. It's just simply my speculation based on just how downhill things went. But anyway, Vince was briefly hospitalized in 2003 or 2004, it's reported as both, after he was picked up by Ontario Provincial Police, who found him walking along the highway, quote, following the sun, end quote, because he said that God told him to do so. Once in Canada, he met and married a woman named Anna, who later said that Vince used to just disappear for long periods of time. He would just randomly take unexplained bus trips and sometimes just rambled and talked to himself. She knew that he'd been hospitalized before, but during this time he did not seek medical attention for his mental illness. In Canada, he also got a job at the Grant Memorial Church in Winnipeg, and according to his employer, whose name was Pastor Castor Troy. No. According to Pastor Castor, Vince was really good at his job. He was a happy guy. There were no issues with him. There was a little bit of a language barrier between him and the people who actually went to the church, but that didn't seem to upset him. He was just a friendly and nice guy who did his job and did his job well. Pastor Castor said of Vince, and I quote, "I think that he would occasionally feel frustrated by not being able to communicate or understand. But we have very patient staff members, and he seemed to respond well." He didn't stay long at this job at the church, however. He ended up quitting, and he moved on to a job as a forklift operator, while during this time his wife was working as a waitress. And it was shortly after this that he made another big, life pivot when he decided he was gonna just go off to Edmonton. But he was gonna do so without telling his wife or bringing her along with him, so he just bailed on her out of nowhere. Was deuces, it's been fun. Don't call me, I'll call you. He ended up leaving Anna a note that just said, quote, "I'm gone. Don't look for me. I wish you were happy." Once Vince was out on his own, he got a couple of random jobs. He got a job at a Walmart, he got a job at a fast food place, and he ended up doing deliveries for a newspaper, I believe. And during this time, for the most part, again, things were uneventful. People said that he was a good employee, that he was reliable, he was respectful, he showed up on time. He was just like a good person to work with. There was only one real noteworthy issue that came, and it came about a month before the fateful bus ride that brings us here today. And Vince was working at Walmart, and he got into a disagreement with some coworkers that resulted in him being fired. I couldn't find specifics on what happened, like what this disagreement was, but it was bad enough that he got fired. And this was right before the bus ride happened. And this was the only noteworthy even issue that I found at all regarding Vince in any of his former life prior to the incident that brought us here today. Now, it was shortly after this that Vince asked for some time off, because I guess he was working multiple jobs at the same time, and he asked his employer at the newspaper delivery service for some time off because he was going to go job hunting in Winnipeg. So now we are in the days leading up to this horrible event, and it's about noon in July of 2008, and Vince boards a bus headed for Winnipeg, but he ends up getting off early in a town called Erickson, Manitoba, which is where he ends up catching the bus later that Tim McClean was on. And he got off, and I read in one source that the place that he got off wasn't even a bus stop, and that the bus driver tried to stop him, but he just wasn't listening, and he got off anyway. But either way, he got off with 5 pieces of luggage, and he ended up sleeping on a park bench that night because there was only one bus that was going to be coming through the city every 24 hours, and the bus had already come through, so he just stayed and slept on a park bench that night. According to one witness who saw Vince that night, Vince was seen at about 3 a.m. doing something totally casual, not weird at all, and it was him sitting on that park bench, bolt upright, straight as can be, staring straight ahead, eyes wide as pies, just staring at nothing. Which is not creepy at all, right? It's casual. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Everything's cool. Nothing's cool. Nothing's okay. Anyways, while still on that park bench, Vince ended up selling his laptop, a fairly new laptop, to a 15-year-old boy. Now, apparently this bus stop was like a bus station and a gas station, and this 15-year-old kid worked at the gas station, so he had seen Vince for a prolonged period of time before the transaction took place. The laptop that the kid purchased contained things like personal letters and photos, as well as a note that expressed feelings of guilt at leaving China, that basically Vince was feeling guilty for leaving China for Canada, and just confusion about life in Canada in general. And Vince sold this laptop to this 15-year-old kid for $60, even though he had a sign that said $600 or best offer. He was like, you know what, $60, $600, what's the difference? Sure, take it. After the whole murder took place, the laptop ended up actually being seized by the RCMP, which is like Canadian police, because they needed to take it in as evidence. They're trying to find out everything they can about this guy, right? So they end up going and taking the laptop away from this kid, who I guess he was so excited he like asked the guy if he'd accept $60, or I think he asked him if he'd accept $100 or something. And then he like ran to his bank or home somewhere to get money and came back. Like it was a whole thing for him. So he was really excited to get this laptop, and now he was out a laptop and out $60. And they were like, you know, maybe you'll get it back, but like probably not. And for a fun fact for you, I read that this kid ended up actually getting a new laptop because some anonymous businessman in Montreal heard about what happened and heard that this kid had actually come forward to the police to let them know he had bought the laptop. Like, through the goodness of his heart, he was trying to be an honest and good citizen, and so this businessman went out of his way to buy this kid a brand new laptop. And I just thought that was pretty cool, and I thought you would think that was pretty cool. And a fun fact. When interviewed, this kid said of Vince and his demeanor and everything that day, and I quote, "He had like no emotion to him, but he didn't seem like he was a very nasty guy. He just seemed calm and normal." And I don't know, I just think that this kid's kind of awesome. When I was reading about this and reading about this kid, I thought he was kind of awesome because as a 15-year-old kid, like, teenage kids are kind of sons of bitches, right? I think we can kind of agree there. If you're a 15, 16-year-old kid, I'm sorry, you'll grow out of it. And I'm also generalizing, but in my experience, generally. Kind of pieces of little shit. Little assholes. But this kid, though I'm sure he was a little selfish and a little upset that he lost his laptop, his main concern was asking the police if this guy had used his $60 to buy a weapon to commit the crime. And I thought that was really sweet. And the police were like, no, don't worry, that's not what we believe happened. But I thought that was like, that he was even concerned with that. Anyways, Vince took that money, got his bus ticket, got on the bus, and it was an almost full Greyhound bus carrying 36 of the 55 possible passengers. And one passenger noted that before Vince got on the bus, he seemed bothered and agitated and had been pacing back and forth and talking to himself. Now, initially, Vince had chosen a seat towards the front of the bus. But eventually, during like a smoke break when they all got back on the bus, Vince switched seats to the back of the bus and sat directly beside Tim McClean. Tim didn't really acknowledge him. The two didn't talk. Tim already had his headphones on. He leaned his head against the glass. He was ready to nap. He had been awake. Or he'd been on the bus a while. I can't say he'd been awake a while, but he'd been on the bus a while. He wasn't really interested in having a conversation at that time. Tim had been traveling alone. He had been hanging out by himself. He had been listening to his iPod. He had been texting his friends, and it's so heartbreaking. He was texting his friends, telling them how excited he was to come home, which like broke my heart. He got off at like the scheduled smoke breaks, and people who were on the bus said that he was like a really friendly guy. He would talk to people. He would engage. He wasn't like a dick. He was just like a nice dude, and that he had no fights with anybody. And just like when they got back on the bus, he just kind of kept to himself and did his own thing. Now, I'm not sure exactly how long Vince and Tim had been sitting next to each other before things went off the rails. But boy, did they go off the fucking rails. I read that it was anywhere from a half an hour to an hour. But witnesses reported that out of nowhere, for no reason, Vince pulled out a large knife. It was described as a Rambo knife, big ass knife, and just started stabbing Tim in the neck and in the chest. And Tim had no chance at all to defend himself or to do anything to stop what was happening to him because he had been asleep at the time that the attack started. When this attack broke out, the whole bus turned into an absolute circus. As I'm sure you can imagine, one man ran to the front of the bus and like told the bus driver what was happening so he could pull over to the side of the road. Some people just like ran immediately off the bus. Some people sat frozen in their seats. One woman I read who was sitting near where the attack was happening in the back of the bus took her toddler and threw her toddler over several seats to get the baby to safety and away from what was happening. Eventually, though, everyone did snap out of being shocked and, you know, whatever they were thinking at that time, and everybody did get off the bus and nobody else was seriously injured during this whole attack. At one point during the attack, once everyone had gotten off the bus, Vince actually tried to get off the bus. He came down to where the bus doors were, but the bus driver, like, closed the door so he couldn't get out. But Vince had already, like, stuck his arm out with the knife and was, like, waving it at people through the closed bus doors, which sounds like an actual horror movie to me. But eventually he gave up and he pulled his arm back through, and then he went back over to Tim and continued to, like, stab and cut up his body. Like, he did a lot. He did a lot. And at one point, some people who were off the bus while this was happening kind of like came to their senses and realized like we need to try to do something. So it was two guys that got back on the bus, a bus driver of another bus and a truck driver, both of which had seen the commotion and had pulled over to offer their assistance. So these two guys were like, fuck, like we need to get on and help this man who's being attacked. So they arm up with, I believe, a hammer and a crowbar that the truck driver had with him. And they get on the bus to try to help Tim. But at this point, Vince is wild and he's slashing the knife at them. And they're like, bro, you need to calm down. They're trying to like de-escalate the situation. And then Vince ends up turning his attention back to Tim and just keeps stabbing him over and over. And at one point, he just says quietly and calmly to the two men, get emergency. And so they were like, fuck this. And they get off the bus because they've realized at this point there is no saving Tim. Like, there was too much damage done to him at this point. When Tim's body was later looked at, it was found that he definitely did struggle and try to fight back because he did have defensive wounds on his body. But because of where he was seated, he had seats in front of him, he had a window on one side, and he had Vince standing over him, stabbing him, so he wasn't able to escape. And at one point, he either fell or was thrown down to the floor of the bus, where he continued to be stabbed. Vince stabbed him over and over and over, and later it came out that he believed that if he didn't, Tim was going to kill him, and that he also believed that Tim had the powers to come back to life. So he didn't just stab Tim over and over. He dismembered him and scattered his body into different areas of the bus, to some various different places, and some of the pieces of him were preserved in plastic bags. As passengers watched from the street through the windows of the bus, Vince cut off Tim's head, straight decapitated him, and then held his head up to the bus windows so that everybody below could observe what he had done. He then continued to stab Tim over and over, cutting off different parts of his body and even eating some of Tim's flesh. Witnesses also said that Vince seemed completely unaware and oblivious to the fact that there were other people like watching what he was doing. He was very calm, he was very cool, he was very collected. I think he was even still wearing his sunglasses during the attack. A passenger who witnessed the event said later of it, and I quote, "There was no rage or anything. He was like a robot stabbing the guy." At about 8:30 p.m. that night, the RCMP received word that there was a stabbing victim on a Greyhound bus west of the city. And that is a serious understatement, if I do say so myself, and I do say so myself. When officers arrived at the scene, Vince was still on the bus and he was acting erratically. The witnesses told the police that Vince had tried to leave the bus, he had tried to escape, but that a couple of the guys had stopped him because when that passing trucker had like stopped, when he saw the commotion, he had brought out a hammer and a crowbar and all this shit so that they could arm up and keep Vince at bay. And at one point, apparently, Vince even tried to take off in the bus. The pigeon straight tried to drive the bus, bro, but the bus driver ended up engaging the bus immobilization system, which I didn't know was a thing, and I might be quoting that wrong, but basically it made it so that the bus was inoperable. So due to that, Vince was trapped on the bus with Tim, and so he continued to take out his rage, frustration, whatever was going on with him, because they didn't really say that he was rageful, but he was stuck in there with the bus, stuck in there in the bus with Tim, and he just kept stabbing him over and over. He kept like grabbing his head and carrying it back and forth, and all these poor people are standing on the side of the road watching through the windows because it's happening right there, and they're like holding each other and crying, and some of them are even throwing up because it's like a lot to witness and be a part of. So Vince wasn't leaving at this point. The cops were there and he wasn't getting out and he wasn't letting the officers in to arrest him. He just kept pacing the length of the bus and continuing to disrespect Tim's body. Officers even witnessed him eating parts of Tim's body and hearing him say, quote, "I have to stay on this bus forever," which no one wants. So by 9 p.m., they were in a standoff and had to call in special negotiators and an armed tactical unit for help. And meanwhile, the other passengers from the bus were taken to the Brandon RCMP detachment, which I believe is a police station. Let me know, Canadian friends, if I'm wrong. And they questioned them, and then they put them up in a hotel for the night. Because remember, they were just all trying to get from point A to point B, and now they were trapped in hell. So they were put in a hotel for the night while all of this played out. Things finally came to a close on July 31st, 2008 at about 1:30 a.m. So it's around 5 hours after this whole ordeal began. And that's when Vince tried to escape the bus by busting out a window. So he broke the window, he threw out some of his personal items, he threw out the knife, and then he jumped head first out of the bus window, straight swan dived out of the window landing on the knife. Police swarm him, attempt to arrest him. He starts fighting. He goes crazy. He obviously doesn't want to get arrested. Things are not connecting, not firing well up there at this time. And he ends up getting tased several times before being arrested and put in the back of a police cruiser. When searching the bus, police found various parts of Tim's body in plastic bags, as I said, scattered around the bus. They also found his ears, his nose, and his tongue inside Vince's pocket. And part of his heart and his eyes were never recovered because it's believed that Vince ate them. I upload this video at like 6 a.m. and I know some of you guys watch it at 6 a.m. So like, is that not like a lot of information in the morning? Have you even had your coffee yet? Jesus crust. So, in case you're wondering about the passengers who were taken off the bus at 10 a.m. the next day, Greyhound representatives took these people to the store to buy them some new clothes to replace the clothes that were on the bus because this bus was now a crime scene. And they then transported these people back to Winnipeg, which is where they were heading. Now, I couldn't find out how they transported them, but I really wanted to because I was wondering, did they like put them on another bus? Can you imagine getting on another bus after that? Because I literally cannot imagine that. But they were just like sent home to go about their lives, I guess, as best as they can, though I don't know how you could, because a lot of these people were just totally fucked up and traumatized by what they saw. Because though could they, in theory, have looked away? Yeah, but a lot of people didn't, and it's kind of like how human beings as a species always want to see the super morbid shit, morbid makeup, the super morbid shit. Like when you drive by a car wreck and everyone slows down and you have to stop and look because you want to see. And that's what these people did, and what they saw was one of the worst things you could ever see. I do know that a lot of these people suffered a lot of problems mentally and emotionally after seeing what they saw. They were suffering from a lot of trauma and like shells of their former self. And I did even read that one RCMP officer who was there at the scene actually ended up taking his own life, and that his family said after the fact that he was suffering from PTSD from that day. A couple of bus passengers even ended up filing a lawsuit against Greyhound Buses, Vince Lee, the RCMP, and the government of Canada for subjecting them to the horrible murder of Tim McClean. There were two women, Deborah Tucker and Kaylee Shaw, who tried to get $3 million in damages for the trauma they experienced that day and what they witnessed. The women were claiming that the company did not provide adequate protection or security on its buses, and due to this horrible thing they saw, they were left with anxiety, depression, and PTSD. I did end up seeing that these women ended up dropping the lawsuit. I didn't see if anyone else was involved in the lawsuit or if it was successful, but I just thought it was worth mentioning that the Where Are They Now segment. I mean, where were they then? Because this was a couple years ago, but you know what I mean. Anyways, back to that day and Vince and everything and Tim. When Vince was arrested that day, he had blood all over him. His face was smeared with blood, and he was surprisingly polite and apologetic. He kept telling the officers he was sorry, and he was begging them to take his life. And he said to them, quote, "I'm sorry, I'm guilty, please kill me." At the time that he was arrested and sent to trial, he was suffering from some pretty serious hallucinations. He was hearing voices. He said it was only a matter of time before God killed him. This is what he believed was going to happen to him. And so he was put on some pretty heavy antipsychotic medication. So when Vince was brought into the court and charged with second-degree murder, he just kind of sat quietly, and the only thing he was reported saying was to anyone who was near him and would listen, he was just begging them to kill him. At the request of the Crown Attorney, which I believe is a prosecutor in the U.S., the judge actually ordered Vince to have a mental assessment done, both to see if he was competent to stand trial and to see if he was criminally responsible for murdering Tim McClean. Vince ended up meeting with a forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Stanley Yaron for 19 court-ordered assessment interviews to see if Vince was in fact fit to stand trial and to see if he could even be considered criminally responsible for what he did in light of his brain being all types of scrambled eggs, quite frankly. Vince's trial began on March 3rd, 2009, and there was serious security at the courthouse during that time because there was a big fear that people would come and straight up try to attack or murder Vince. Vince ended up claiming, like, his plea was that he was not guilty because at the time he was not criminally responsible because he had been having a psychotic break when he killed Tim. And psychiatrists from both the defense and the Crown, so both sides, had psychiatrists who corroborated this and said that when Vince killed Tim, he was hearing voices from God telling him to do so. And both sides agreed that because of this, Vince was not and shouldn't be held criminally responsible. And Vince said that, like, essentially what this meant is that he knew what he had done. He admitted what he had done. He acknowledged what he had done, but that he didn't mean to do what he had done, that the intent to murder Tim, the mens rea, was not there. And he even acknowledged that he had done it, but he was having a lot of trouble coming to terms with the fact that he had actually also eaten a part of Tim, and I could definitely see how that would be hard for anyone to wrap their brain around. Tim's friends and family were at this hearing, obviously, and they were wearing t-shirts with pictures of Tim on the front, and they just sat and they sobbed as they heard, the whole case, heard all the details of the case, and then heard what both sides were saying about the man who did this to Tim. One of the psychiatrists said that essentially Vince had been sitting on the bus when he started hearing voices from God telling him that he had to kill Tim. He had to kill Tim right then, or he himself would die. And in a later interview, Vince said of this time and this murder and what he did, and I quote, "The voice told me that I was the third story of the Bible, that I was like the second coming of Jesus, and that I was to save people from a space alien attack." He continued stating, "I was really scared. I remember cutting off his head. I believed he was an alien. The voices told me to kill him, that he would kill me or others. I do not believe this now." The presiding judge at Vince's trial ended up accepting the diagnosis from the various psychiatrists and therefore found that Vincent Lee was not criminally responsible for the murder of Tim McClean. Instead of being sent to prison, Vince was remanded to the Selkirk Mental Health Center in western Manitoba. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this verdict seriously upset the people who loved Tim. Tim's mother, Carol, said of the verdict, and I quote, "He should be held responsible for it. He still did it. Whether he was in the right frame of mind or not, he still did the act. There was nobody else on that bus holding a knife and slicing up my child." Tim's father said the fact that Vince could receive counseling, receive medication, and at some point be released back into the world after doing such a fucking horrifying thing, just like blew his mind. It was really hard for him to wrap his mind around. And he ended up saying of this, and I quote, "I have a fear that he may get out one day. My fear is that Vincent Lee may get out and be released into the public one day. I fear for the public. This should not have happened." His dad, which is like a little fact that's not really prevalent to the case, but something that I found very sweet, he actually got a tattoo of Tim across his chest in remembrance of his son. And I just thought that that was a really sweet and beautiful way to honor his lost child. And you guys know, I like tattoos, so that definitely caught my eye, especially because portraits are such a, this is like a whole nother thing off, but portraits are not like a super easy thing to do. So I didn't see the tattoo. I'm going to look for it and see if I can find some photos to post for you, because portraits are really hard to do. And I don't actually know much about the Canadian tattoo industry and like what their artists are like out there. I know that a lot of artists in other countries are just like beautiful anytime, if it's not my husband. That I see like a tattoo that I'm like, fuck, I really want that. And then I look where the artist is based. I'm like, overseas. Okay, great. Cool. Anyway, the Crown Attorney said after hearing the verdict, and I quote, "Mr. Lee is a schizophrenic. Mr. Lee, in my opinion, and in the opinion of the psychiatrist, had no idea what he was doing was wrong. People who are mentally ill should not be convicted when they don't know what they did was wrong. They need to be treated. I certainly agree that in Mr. Lee's case, he needs to be treated for a very long time." And it's very interesting to me because you don't see a lot of cases like this where like both the prosecution and defense just agree that this person was mentally unstable. I think I've only covered one other case where that was the case. I think that was Isabella Guzman, the girl. If you haven't seen that video, I'll link it. But they killed her mother and then like went on to make the TikTok girl. So it's very interesting to see like what he must have been real off for both sides to agree. You know what I mean? It's just a note that I don't come upon this type of ruling very often. So initially, Vince was kept inside a like locked wing 24 hours a day at the Selkirk Mental Hospital where he was sent. But each year when the review boards would have meetings about him, he would start getting granted more and more freedoms. On February 10th, 2017, the Manitoba Criminal Code Review Board ordered Vince Lee to be discharged. He was granted an absolute discharge, and there would be no legal obligations or restrictions pertaining to Vince's independent living, and he changed his name to Will Baker. So as of then, 2017, he's just free. He spent less than 10 years in a mental institution, and I did read reports that is low for the typical duration in a hospital like that, but that he was a fucking great patient and that he responded super well to treatment and responded super well to medication. So yeah, that means he's been free like 5 years now, if I can do basic addition, but who knows? Not a mathematician over here, but either way, this freedom didn't come immediately. I know it seems pretty fast because like it's less than 10 years, but apparently it started with like he wasn't allowed out of the wing. Then he was allowed supervised walks just on the grounds of the hospital, where he had to have like 2 or 3 people with him at all times. Then it was supervised visits into town. Then it was unsupervised visits into town. Then unsupervised overnight visits to like a group home he was planning to live in. And then absolute freedom. Chris Somerville, who is the Chief Executive Officer for the Schizophrenic Society of Canada, said that Vince was a model patient and he was soft-spoken and humble and remorseful for what he did and determined to stay on his schizophrenia medication. Tim's mother said of this decision to release her son's murderer, and I quote, "I need for Vince Lee and people like him to remain in a locked facility where they can make sure that they get their medications, where they're being treated for their illness. They're treated with compassion, but the rest of the public is kept safe. That's what I need to move forward, carry on. I'll never get my son back regardless of what I do or what I've done already." She continued, "They get to a point where they're feeling well, that they don't require the medication, that it's everyone else that is sick. A killer is a killer, even if they are mentally ill." I am very curious what you guys think about that quote and that sentiment, because I feel like you could go either way. I feel like it is a bit of a generalization, but I do feel like it does, what she's saying is common and does happen. So I'm curious as to what you think. Do you think that Vince should have ever been released? Do you think if he was released, he should have been watched more carefully? Or do you think it's appropriate that he is completely and fully released in this capacity with the hopes that he continues to take his medication? Because I know mental illness is just that. It is an illness, and illnesses can be addressed and healed. So I'm just curious, in a case like this, with these extremes, what you think. I know that Tim's mother has been running a website. It's www.timslaw.ca, and on this website she highlights cases where people have committed violent crimes, have gone into mental health institutes where they've been treated, cured, healed, whatever, and released, and upon their release, they reoffend. And so I'm just curious what you guys think. We can call this the question of the day if you'd like, though it is a difficult question to answer. It's complex. That's why it's not black and white. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having a conversation. But I'm curious as to what you think when it comes to this. Do you think that Vince should have ever been released? Or in the alternative, when it comes to these sort of releases in cases like this, how do you think they should be handled if they are to be released at all? That's what I leave to you. So let me know, because I'm curious as to seeing what you guys say, because some of you guys have some very passionate answers for some of my questions, and I want your passion. Le passion. I want it. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and it gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, thank you for remembering Tim McClean with me today. I truly cannot imagine going through what he went through. And I know, at least based on what witnesses say, we have some sort of solace in knowing that he was asleep when it started. He didn't see it coming, and it happened so fast that he probably didn't suffer much. But that's so scary to think about. Somebody just randomly murdering you while you sleep on a public bus. That's so fucked up. And it's like, to be killed so brutally and then have your body disrespected so badly after the fact. It's just so dehumanizing and horrific. And I feel like horrific's one of those words. It's like, does that even describe it? Because I feel like that word loses all meaning when you talk about something this intense. This case is just so fucked up, man. And this is one that I even told my husband about. He let me tell him about it, and he was not happy to hear it. It freaked him out, to be quite honest, because I think a lot of you know, or if you don't, I don't drive. So I take the bus everywhere. So to tell him this case got him all freaked out, especially with the baby. He's like, okay, we got to get you a knife. We got to get you all this type of protection, get you those cat ear things for your keychain. Like, he's real protective of something happening to me now. So this case definitely triggered something in him. And I told him, like, what are the odds that something like that would ever happen? 50-50. It'll either happen or it won't. Chuck Klosterman, sex, drugs, and cocoa. Nothing. It's just very tragic, and it's very sad. And I feel like there's not even much of a takeaway here, because there's not much anyone could have done to prevent it. That's what's so messed up. Sometimes we can look at it and be like, you could have done this. The state could have done this. This could have been addressed sooner. But Vince wasn't violent prior to this. And there's a lot of people that you see that are suffering from mental illness, like walking on the street, talking to themselves. I see them every day. And most of the time, these people aren't violent. So, like, there's not much that anyone could have done to have addressed it sooner. And there's not much Tim could have done to take better precautions. So it's just tragic and horrific and pointless and hard to think about. Come gather around and let me tell you the story of John Hinckley Jr. Our story today begins on March 30th, 1981, and this is at the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. It was a totally normal day, except that a bunch of people had actually gathered outside of this hotel with the hopes of getting a glance, getting a wave, getting a smile from the new president, Ronald Reagan. He had been in office at this point, I believe it was 69 days. Nice. And he was giving a speech for a labor convention at the hotel. It was just before 2:30 p.m. when Ronald Reagan exited the hotel, and he was surrounded by Secret Service agents, and he was headed towards the motorcade. There was, all these people around yelling at him, trying to get his attention. He's waving, he's smiling, he's doing what presidents do. And all of a sudden, a young man steps from the crowd and yells, "Mr. President, Mr. President," before raising a .22 caliber gun that held 6 bullets and just completely unloading the gun, hitting 4 people, shooting 4 people, and one of these people was Ronald Reagan. So Reagan and the other men that were shot were quickly rushed to nearby hospitals, and the shooter was quickly, taken into custody and taken to a secondary location to be questioned, because they needed to figure out, who this guy was and why he did what he did. The who he was an easy question to answer because he had identification on him. So they were able to determine that this was 25-year-old John Hinckley Jr. But the why he did what he did, why he tried to assassinate the 40th president of the United States, a man who had just taken office, who, he was famous. We'll get into that a little bit later. He had, a history before him. But why John Hinckley Jr. tried to kill Ronald Reagan had nothing to do with politics, because you think somebody's trying to kill the president, they probably don't like the president. Had nothing to do with politics, had nothing to do with this particular man at all in general. He had actually chosen somebody else to kill before this, but just hadn't done it. His reason was that he had become obsessed with the child actress Jodie Foster and decided that the best way he could get her attention and make her realize how much he loved her was to assassinate the president. So that's about how much I knew about this case going into it. That was the information that I knew before researching this case. So now, look at the runtime. I'm about to tell you everything I learned, starting with who John was and then how we got here. John Hinckley Jr. was born on May 29th, 1955, and he was born in Ardmore, Oklahoma, but he and his family moved to Dallas, Texas when he was just 4 years old, and that is where he was raised, like the majority of his life. He was one of 3 children, and he was said to have like an ideal childhood. He had a loving and devoted mother who doted on him, doted on all of the kids. She was like, you know, the quintessential mom. She was good at it, so they say. And he had like a good father who was successful in business. He was an oil tech executive, so the family did not have to want for very much in terms of like finances. Growing up, John did well in school. He was actually a bit of a jock in his younger years, like his elementary school and his middle school. He played basically all the sports. He played football, basketball, soccer, hockey, like all the things you can think of, he pretty much did it. And he was also very into music, which is something that will come up later in, you know, what he went on to do, and also the where is he now situation. We'll get into that a little bit later. But he played piano and he played guitar, and he was even elected as class president, which, you know, says he must have been well liked, because a class president election is really just a popularity contest, right? Right. John attended Highland Park School in University Park, Texas, which is a lot of parks and a lot of school-related names for one sentence, but this was a school that was located in Dallas, Texas. It was around this time that things sort of changed for John, like the end of high school, beginning of adulthood, because he started to change. The guy that was, you know, popular, well-liked, into sports, all that, he started to withdraw. He started to become more isolated. He wasn't really interested in the things he used to be interested in, and he tried to get help for this. He was put on medication, but it just got worse. It didn't really seem to help, and then it got way worse when he went off to college, because then he was even more isolated, so the little bit of interaction he had while he was still living at home was completely gone. So around this time, he was trying to keep it together, but he was having trouble doing so. And this was a problem for him, and it made him feel inferior, because remember, he came from a successful family, so whether there were expectations for him or whether he felt there were expectations for him, that was in the back of his mind. And he didn't feel like he was living up to those expectations when his siblings were. His sister Diane was doing really well in school. She got straight A's. She was doing well for herself. And his brother Scott had even gone on to be like the president of his dad's company. So in comparison, he would have been seen as like the least successful in like societal terms. And he was going to school, but he was struggling with it. So he would go and then he would leave, and then he would go and then he would leave. And finally he just kind of said, fuck it, I don't want to do this anymore. And he moved to Hollywood, California to try to pursue a music career. Now, he moved there, and that's great, but the thing is, he wasn't doing great mentally at that time, so he had all these, like, grandiose dreams of being a famous musician, but he wasn't doing anything to actually try to pursue that dream. He moved there, but he wasn't going out and trying to become a musician. He was just staying in his tiny apartment, watching TV, like, eating fast food, doing all of that, but not actually going out and trying to, you know, play shows and get exposure. So he would sit at home and be frustrated that things weren't just happening for him, even though he wasn't putting in work so people could know he existed. And he felt like he was like an untapped, unrecognized talent. And because he wasn't like making it, because he wasn't trying to make it, he was just getting more angry and more bitter. So that's not great, right? Somebody who's already struggling with mental health, now he's angry and bitter and feels like he deserves something that he's not putting in work to get. So he's just getting more and more frustrated. And then once, you know, popular class president, he started to isolate himself. And then once he moved to California, he didn't maintain any of those friendships that he did have, because he had some friendships. He wasn't totally alone. He just didn't have many. When he moved, he had 0, and he didn't try to make any new ones. So he's totally alone. And then you take that and you add the fact that he had a new interest that he had been developing as he got older, and this was guns. John liked guns. He loved guns, which is just a recipe for disaster with his mental health issues. Let's just say that now. Like, if you are struggling mentally, maybe you don't have guns. I feel like that's not controversial, but maybe it is. I guess we'll find out in the comments. But he was really into them, bought several of them, and taught himself how to use them and shoot them effectively. So what do we have here now? We have a mentally ill man who's getting worse by the day. He's angry, he's bitter, and he's very interested in guns. He owns several guns and knows how to use them, and he probably shouldn't have them because he's not doing well mentally in the first place. And then he, like the Bjork stalker, starts to fixate on media. He watches movies, he watches TV shows, and he kind of obsesses about these actors' lives. And one particular actress that he got a very, for lack of a better word, deadly obsession with is Jodie Foster. Now, I think we probably all know who Jodie Foster is, but just in case we don't worry, I will be putting photos of her up on the screen. So Jodie Foster was born in Los Angeles on November 19th, 1962, and she started acting at the young, ripe age of 3 years old. So real quick, I have a question for you. We're going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but what do you think about that? About child actors, about baby actors? Because I know, some stories involve babies, so you need, actors to play said babies, but what do you think about that? Because I guess when Jodie, got discovered, she wasn't even, her mother wasn't taking her to be cast for anything. Her mother was taking her older brother. Her brother was 8 years old, I think, at the time. Took him to a casting to get him into acting. And whoever was there who was in charge of, things, saw baby Jodie, little baby, and was like, that baby? That baby's got the it factor. I want to work with that baby. And I just think is that kind of weird? I don't know, it seems kind of weird. So anyways, she starts working at the young age of 3. She starts doing a lot of TV work before finally breaking into the movies in 1972, when she would have been 10 years old. She did movies here and there, some Disney stuff, but none were, that film that made her a star until she was cast in a leading role in the movie Taxi Driver. The movie came out in 1976 when she was 14, but the filming of this was when she was just 12 years old. Okay, so she was really young in this movie, and this movie was a Martin Scorsese film, and I don't know if you've heard about him, but he's kind of a big deal, so this was a huge opportunity for her. Anyways, the movie. I've actually only seen it one time, so please don't, if you're a big fan, I'm so sorry that I'm not more familiar with it, but it is across the board regarded as just chef's kiss. It stars a young, hot Robert De Niro. And when people are always saying, the quote, you talking to me? You talking to me? That's from the movie Taxi Driver. Basically, Robert De Niro's character is the main character, and he works at night as a taxi driver. Roll credits. And basically, throughout the run of the movie, his mental health deteriorates. During this time, he becomes obsessed with a woman named Betsy who worked in politics. So to try to impress her, Robert De Niro's character decides that he's going to kill a presidential candidate. Sounds familiar, right? Except in the movie, De Niro's character didn't actually do this, whereas John Hinckley did. Anyways, Jodie Foster's in this movie, and at 12 years old, she plays a child prostitute. I don't know what the politically correct term is for that, because I generally say sex worker, because I feel like that's the right thing to say. It's just sex worker. But as a child, you can't really consent to that type of work. So whatever word would be appropriate, let me know in the comments, but that is what I mean. And Robert De Niro's character comes upon her throughout the movie and decides that she is somebody who he also wants to save. Now, I don't want to give any spoiler alerts on this 40-year-old movie, so I'm not going to tell you anymore, but you should just watch it if you haven't seen it. So, this is the movie that made Jodie Foster a star, and this is the movie that John Hinckley saw her in that made him become obsessed with her and simultaneously become obsessed with the movie Taxi Driver. His obsession with this movie lasted for years. He watched it over and over, and each time he watched it, he became a little more and more obsessed with Jodie Foster, but not really her as a person, more so her character in this movie. He felt like he was in love with the character in this movie, a 12-year-old girl. And in watching this movie, he sort of started to morph him and his life and Robert De Niro's characters in his life together into one thing in his mind. So with that, John was kind of like, okay, I love Jodie. De Niro loved Betsy. De Niro tried to kill a presidential candidate, or thought about killing a presidential candidate to try to win Betsy's favor. I, obviously, should kill the president. That's going to let Jodie know that I love her, and that's going to make Jodie love me. Perfect plan. But he didn't do this right away. First, in 1980, he decided to start to stalk Jodie. Basically, he learned from a magazine article that she had gone off to college in Connecticut. So he was like, okay, I'm going to woo her the old-fashioned way by just kind of showing up where she is and, making her love me. So he literally upped and moved to Connecticut to stalk her. So at this point in Hinckley's plan, Jodie was a couple of years older, so she was still working and simultaneously pursuing a literature degree at Yale. Ever heard of it? Talk about an overachiever. So at this point in time, she was very famous, right? She was doing very well in her job, but she had the presence of mind to know that this type of job isn't super secure. It's cruel and it's unfair and it's uncertain. And she also knew that, that child actors don't always have a lot of longevity. So she wanted to make sure that even though she was doing really well right now, she had something to fall back on in case things didn't work out for her. And the thing that she had to fall back on was studying literature at Yale. So John, he would go to where she was. He would call her on the phone. He would show up where she lived and shove love notes under her door. He even wrote her a poem called I Know a Girl, in which he professed his love to her. During this time, John also told his parents that he had a girlfriend. He had a girlfriend who was an actress, because in his mind, he truly believed that these two were dating. John Hinckley was even able to get Jodie on the phone on more than one occasion. He called and he actually talked to her. And during these phone calls, he recorded them so people, could hear them. And in these calls, he just sounds so nervous. He's stumbling over his words. He messes up his own name, but he's trying to woo her. And she's just like, what the fuck? And she's talking to him, but she's kind of making a joke about it. And she kind of laughs and her friends are there and they kind of laugh. And he's like, what are you laughing at? What are they laughing at? And she's like, we're laughing at you, bro. What do you think? This is so weird. And it is weird. It's just so weird that he was even able to do this, considering she was so famous and she was so young. It's weird that he had access to her. I mean, John Lennon would go on to be murdered by a crazed fan later that year in New York, and this stalking did go on for a while, so you would think she'd be better protected, but she just wasn't. He would just call her over and over, and whenever he'd get her on the phone, she'd tell him oh no, not you again. And she told him I really can't talk to you. You understand that I can't carry on conversations like this with people I don't know. It's weird and it's dangerous. And he was like, well, just so you know, I'm not dangerous. I would never hurt you. And she responded yeah, but still no. And he's like, so you don't want me to call you anymore? And she's like, yes, please don't call me anymore. But it's been nice talking to you. Now, this was really confusing to him because in his mind, there was a connection there. There was something between them and that he just needed to talk to her. She needed to speak to him and to know him, to realize that she loved him, and she wasn't giving him this chance. So even though she asked him to stop contacting her, he did not. Now, it seems like Jodie's rejection at this point really started to make John spiral, because this is about the time when he started putting in the work. Yeah, sure. Started putting in the work to make the plan. Started planning, one might say, to murder the president. Now, I said in the beginning that he was trying to assassinate Ronald Reagan, and he actually did. He proceeded to and did shoot Ronald Reagan. But that wasn't actually his first choice of a person to kill, because at the time he started making his plans, Reagan hadn't been elected yet. Reagan was elected in 1981, started serving his term in 1981. History. But basically when he started making his plan to kill the president, Jimmy Carter was still the president. The 39th president was Jimmy Carter, and he served his term from 1977 to 1981 when Reagan was elected. Now, I don't know a ton about Jimmy Carter. Do people like him? Is he a president that people enjoy? I do know that he won the 2002 Nobel Peace Prize, which seems good, but let me know, because I know there are people out there who are really up on their presidential lingo, their presidential info, but I am just simply not that person. That's not something that I store in my brain. But anyways, Jimmy Carter was president, and in 1980, he was going up against the Republican candidate, Ronald Reagan. So he was out on the campaign trail, giving speeches and making promises. And it was during this time that John first thought about putting his plan into action. So he actually went to see one of Jimmy's speeches. Jimmy. We're buds or something, me just calling him by his first name. Aren't there some people out there who, if you don't call them their first and their last name together, it just sounds so weird? Think about this for a second. Imagine if you called Sylvester Stallone, just Sylvester. Hey, Sylvester. Does that sound right to you? No, it doesn't. Jimmy Carter is what I meant. So he puts the plan in motion. He leaves the state to go to where the president was. He's like, okay, I'm going to kill Jimmy Carter. It's going to be great. Jodie is going to love me. But for whatever reason, he changes his mind and he doesn't go through with it. He was there. He was within arm's reach of the president, but he didn't actually go through with killing him. Instead, he just saw him, saw the president, was like, yo, president, whatever, stood there, watched him, and then left and decided instead of murdering him, he was just going to go back to Connecticut to try to win Jodie's favor that way. It was at this time that John Hinckley was first arrested, and that's because, when he went to where Jimmy Carter was, he brought a gun with him. So when he left to go back to Connecticut to see Jodie, he tried to get on the plane with this gun, which is something that you cannot do. So he was arrested. Now, at the time he was arrested, they had no idea what he had this gun for, so he didn't get like a really serious charge. He was just fined a whopping $62 and sent on his way. And he was just fined for, having a firearm on a plane or having a firearm when he shouldn't, basically. Now, it's at this point that his family starts to realize something's wrong because, he gets arrested for having a gun on him. So his mom decides to get him into counseling, which could have been effective, but in his case it wasn't because he wasn't honest. He didn't talk with the counselor about his obsession, and he didn't tell them why he had the gun with him that day. And when I started to think about this point, it made me think about John's mental health status and his ability to tell right from wrong, because that is going to come into play later. We're talking a lot about his mental health, and that's because of, his defense at trial, right? Cool. So I wonder, isn't him not telling the counselor everything, omitting the obsession, omitting the reason he brought the gun, doesn't that show that he knew that these things were wrong and that's why he didn't say anything? That was just a thought that I had. So basically, the long and short of this counseling session is after meeting with John, the counselor's suggestions for John's parents is that they should stop supporting him financially because since they were well off, they had been doing that. They should have him move out of their house because by this point he had moved back in with them. And they should kind of make him become his own person, all that jazz. It's like, stop fucking taking care of him. He's an adult. Let him be an adult on his own. And his parents were like, that's not going to be super hard for us to do because he's kind of difficult to live with right now anyway. So he moves out. Time marches on. Jimmy Carter loses the election by like a shit ton, which was fortunate for him because now he's not on John Hinckley's list of, well, I guess he didn't have a list of people to kill. He just had one person. And now that one person isn't Jimmy Carter because he's not president, so killing him would be pointless. So now he has his sights set. He has to kill Ronald Reagan, the former actor now elected as 40th president of the United States. Now, Ronald Reagan had an interesting life, and as I'm sure you can imagine, because he was president, there is a shit ton of information on him out there, and this video is already pretty long, so I'm not going to go into the whole backstory of Ronald Reagan. I'll just tell you that he came from a humble beginning. He ended up working in radio before acting in some small roles in some popular movies before becoming president of the Screen Actors Guild, then going into politics, first becoming the governor of California, then entering national politics. People seemed to like him. He was seen as like the first people's president because he'd spent years in the spotlight and media, and so he had developed like a very likable personality, a little bit of a persona. He was like the cowboy president who people felt like they could relate to because he kind of simplified complex ideas in a way and like said them in a way that like the normal person could understand. And there's more to it than that because obviously everybody didn't love him. That's politics, baby. There's always someone on the other side. But the point is, he was now the president, and John Hinckley now wanted to kill him. So this plan, or at least a plan, started taking form. He started acting on it in March of 1981. So after his parents had kicked him out of their house, he was living in an apartment before finally moving into a motel in Colorado. He was taking medication on and off, kind of trying to get better. He had a job, he had everything, and he decided to just up and leave, and he decided to go to California again, because remember, he wanted to pursue a career in music, and he still wanted this. So he goes to California again with the dreams of making it big, but by this time, his mind is so far gone that he can barely function. So pretty soon after getting there, he thinks to himself, like, I have nothing else to live for. Like, there is no point in me being on this earth anymore. So with that, a 25-year-old John Hinckley started a cross-country trip with the plans of committing a murder. But this time it wasn't to murder Ronald Reagan. He was driving to Connecticut to kill Jodie Foster and then kill himself. Or just to kill himself in front of Jodie. He hadn't decided yet. But this was his first plan. Well, actually his second plan. His first plan was to go to California. That didn't work out, so now he was going to Connecticut. During this time, he wrote a letter to Jodie, and this letter said, quote, Jodie, goodbye. I love you 6 trillion times. Don't you maybe like me just a little bit? You must admit I am different. It would make all this worthwhile. John Hinckley. So he was taking a bus to Connecticut, but he wasn't taking one bus. It wasn't like a straight shot there. He was taking one bus to Washington, D.C. He was getting off there. He was going to stay a night. He checked into the Park Central Hotel. He was going to spend the night, and then the following morning, he was going to get onto another bus and head to Connecticut. But things changed when he was in Washington, D.C., obviously, because that's what we're talking about today. So he arrives in D.C. fully expecting to just spend the night, then get on another bus, head to Connecticut, and then either, kill Jodie and then himself, or just kill himself in front of Jodie, whatever he decided to do once he got there. But he gets there, he spends the night, and that morning, the morning he's set to leave, he goes out, he buys a newspaper, he gets breakfast, I think it was McDonald's, and he heads back to his room, where he starts to read the paper. That's when he found out that Ronald Reagan was going to be giving a speech at the Hilton Hotel in D.C. What are the odds? He thinks to himself. He believes that this is divine intervention. He's like, oh, Jodie doesn't need to die. I don't need to die. Ronald Reagan needs to die. So he stuck around and he started festering on this idea. He studied the president's schedule. He thought about Jodie. He sat down and he wrote her another letter that he did not mail, but it basically just said all the normal things that he had been saying, that he loved her, that this was all for her, that once he did this, she would know who he was. He wrote that there was a good chance that he would die while doing what he was set out to do, so he wanted to make sure that he had his feelings written down so that she could read them. And he wrote to her in part, quote, I am doing all of this for your sake. By sacrificing my freedom and possibly my life, I hope to change your mind about me. This letter is being written an hour before I leave for the Hilton Hotel. Jodie, I'm asking you to please look into your heart and at least give me the chance with this historical deed to gain your respect and love. So, the 30th, Reagan was scheduled to do a speech to a labor convention at the hotel at 2 p.m. So the Secret Service was there, checking everything out, making sure there was nothing weird, doing what Secret Service does. But there was nothing weird, nothing suspicious, nothing stood out at all. One of the men who worked that day said that it was truly an unremarkable day. I guess until it wasn't, obviously. This place was normal to them. They'd been to this Hilton like 100 times in the last decade. It was the place presidents frequented, and there were rarely any hiccups. It was so routine that they felt comfortable. They didn't feel like they needed to wear bulletproof vests or keep people further back. And even though some people considered that there probably should be metal detectors at places the presidents would go, they didn't. They were actually worried that if they were to do this, it might offend people, so they didn't do it. They didn't take safety precautions because they thought it would offend the public, which is wild to see how much things have changed. Can you imagine? Can you even imagine? If you can only imagine. I can't. So Reagan enters the hotel at about 1:45 p.m. He does his speech, takes about 30 minutes, and then him and the Secret Service agents leave, headed towards the motorcade, which is a procession? A group of cars that typically carries and escorts a prominent person. So they headed to their cars. Great. Outside, John was waiting. He was standing in this small alcove that was about 20 feet from where the president had entered the hotel, but he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by a small group of people who were waiting to get a glimpse at the new president, super excited. Like Red and Kitty Foreman when the president came through Wisconsin. That's that 70s show reference. That is not relevant at all, and probably poorly timed with the Danny Masterson thing. But anyways, what was I saying? He's standing in this alcove, and the area that he's at is sort of hidden. Now, from there, everything happens so fast. It's about 2:30 p.m., just before. Ronald Reagan walks out. Everyone starts hooting and hollering, screaming, trying to get his attention. There's a group of people across the street who are really come on, Mr. President, look at me. And he turns and he waves. He's like, hello, yes, it's me. I'm the president. Hello. Right? So he's turned that way. When all of a sudden, John Hinckley steps out from the crowd, goes, Mr. President, and then just unloads his gun. It's a, 22 caliber, 25 caliber? It's a handgun. Holds 6 bullets, and he shoots all 6 bullets in less than 2 seconds. So he knew how to use this gun, and he hit his intended target and several people around him.
One of the shots hits the press secretary. This is Jim Brady, and it hits him right above his left eye, like in his head, dude, above his left eye, and it gets lodged in his brain. And we are going to get more into Jim Brady, because I'm sure anybody watching this is like, talk about Jim Brady. We're going to when we get into like the outcome of everyone and like what happened when they were shot. Next, Tom Delahunty. He was a DC police officer, and he was hit in the back of his neck. It's sad too, because apparently Tom wasn't even normally like one who would be working for the president, because it was going to be his day off, and he wasn't like the Secret Service. He was just a DC police officer, but he decided to volunteer to guard the president, because like, how often are you getting that chance? I read that what he normally did, like his normal job was working with police dogs, but the police dog, the canine officer as they call them, which is so cute I can't handle it, the dog got sick, so he wasn't going to be working, so he decided to, you know, work for the president, and then he gets shot in the fucking neck. Anyway, so he's guarding the president. The first shot rings out. He turns to look at the president, and that's when he's hit in the back of the neck, and he just yells out, "I'm hit." So by this time, the Secret Service men were already reacting, and 50-year-old Jerry Parr, who was the head of the Secret Service, reacted so quickly, dude. The adrenaline must have been out of control, and he grabbed the president and started trying to quickly usher him to a nearby limo. His nearby limo, right? Obviously, the president's limo. Meanwhile, a young Secret Service agent, I think he was like 30 years old. His name was Tim McCarthy. He was shot in the chest as he stood, you know, like this, arms out, trying to block the president while they got him into the limo. And dude, just like with Tom Delahunty, Tim wasn't even supposed to be there working with the president. Like, he was Secret Service, but he wasn't scheduled that day. But then last minute, they received like a request the Secret Service did for like another officer, another agent. Yeah, agent. And him and another guy were both like, oh, who wants to do it? Who wants to do it? So they flipped a coin. And Tim just ended up being the one that had to go. Now, during all this chaos, another Secret Service agent actually did try to like shoot and like kill John to stop him from firing any more shots. But as he tried to shoot him, somebody got into his line of fire and he lost the opportunity. Now, back to Reagan. Fortunately, he did make it into the limousine. Jerry Parr literally like shoved his ass into the limo, jumped on top of him. Another Secret Service agent like shoved their feet in and slammed the door shut just as a bullet actually hit the window of the limousine. But fortunately, you know, it's bulletproof because it's like the president's car. Because if it hadn't been, we probably wouldn't even be telling a survival story right now. But even though this was a very secure vehicle, nothing is perfect. And one of the shots that Hinckley fired was able to penetrate the limo in this weak spot, like in the door frame. So the bullet went in, and Reagan was shot under his left armpit right into his lung. But what's so wild is they don't realize this at first. So they're in the limo, the door's shut, and the driver just hits the gas, hoping and praying that they're not going to run over one of their fellow Secret Service members as they're leaving. Because this driver's main objective is to get the president out of there at all costs. If they accidentally run over and kill their like coworkers, like that sucks, but their job is to get him out of there. And I cannot even imagine having that type of job and just knowing that somebody's life is worth so much more than yours. It seems like an incredibly difficult job to have. But anyways, they're driving away and they don't realize that Reagan's been shot. The Secret Service agent Jerry Parr is in the back with him and pats Reagan down, like does an inspection, looks at him, touches him everywhere, doesn't feel anything, doesn't come back with bloody hands, so they think he's fine. Reagan is in pain though. He's in a lot of pain on his side, but they chalk this up to him being hurt from when he was slammed down and maybe he's got like a bruised or a broken rib or something like that, but they don't realize he's been shot. And I think that is so crazy that you can be shot and not even realize it. And you might be like, he's shot, how is he not bleeding? We are going to get into that. So instead of going to a hospital because they don't think they need it, they start heading to the Crown, which is what they call the White House. I learned in researching this case. Maybe that's something I should have already known, but I didn't. And they're going there because this is like the safest place you can go. There's like an arsenal there from what I have read, but they don't make it there. While they're driving to the White House, Reagan pulls out a handkerchief and starts like dabbing his mouth and coughing into it a little bit. And when he pulls it back, there's blood. But it's not normal blood, it's frothy blood. And as soon as Jerry Parr sees this, he realizes, okay, this is not from a cut lip or something, that's frothy. That means it's coming from his lung. So they assume at this point that maybe when he fell, he broke a rib and it punctured his lung. So that's a big deal. So they decide instead of going to the White House, even though they do have like a medical team on staff there, they're going to go to a nearby hospital, the George Washington University Hospital, because it's closer and they realize this is an emergency.
This ended up being a really good call because every second that went by, Ronald Reagan found himself in more and more pain, and every second that went by, he found himself having a more difficult time breathing. Within 3 minutes, they had arrived at the hospital, and Ronald Reagan insisted on walking himself inside. He's like, I'm the president, I know how things look, I need to be a man and walk myself in. So he walks in, and he makes it about 20 feet inside before all the color drains from his face, his eyes roll in the back of his head, and he just collapses into the arms of his agents. The staff in the hospital quickly realized that this was an emergency, and a vascular surgeon was called down to the ER. So they have Reagan up on, like a table, whatever, and they cut off his suit. And they start to realize, like, here and there, that the person they're working on is the President of the United States. Can you even imagine being in that position? It blows my mind. It's like those people who had to work on John Lennon after he was shot. I cannot imagine being in that position, and they were freaking out. One of the nurses was super freaked out. She was so worried that the president was going to die on her table. She started to panic and she started to cry, and then she started to remember that the only time she had ever seen her own father cry in her entire life was when Kennedy was assassinated, and she thought this was happening all over again. But even though this was such a surreal experience, they did not have the luxury of slowing down and letting it really sink in, because Reagan was in really bad shape. His blood pressure was incredibly low. He had crashed, and that's because he had lost so much blood. He ended up losing half the blood volume in his body, but mostly he was internally bleeding, which is why at this point they still don't know he's been shot. It's just absolute chaos. There are so many people there all working on him at one time. Two of the other men who were shot, Brady and McCarthy, ended up being brought into the same hospital for medical care as well. Tom Dillahunty ended up being brought to another hospital, though I don't know why. And the Secret Service is in there because it's their job, and they have this girl who worked at the hospital, a nurse or a doctor, I couldn't remember which she was, but she was manning the area, letting the Secret Service know who each person was who was coming and going, because they couldn't even make sure that the president was safe before bringing there because everything happened so quickly. And usually, they go and they scope something out, but they just had to bring him there and hope that nobody who was coming in there, who was hoping to help him, was actually going to try to kill him on the table. So Reagan's there. He's on the table, and they're trying to figure out what's wrong. They're listening to his chest, and they listen to one lung, and they hear that it's really hollow. And when they listen to the other one, they realize it's full of blood. So they're like, what the fuck is going on? And it took an intern who was like a pilot in Vietnam, I believe, to look at him. And this person was very familiar with gunshot wounds, obviously, being in Vietnam, to look at him and notice a small slit under his armpit. And he turns and looks at the doctors and is like, this man's been shot. And they still didn't know at this point. It's so crazy. So they all look over and they're like, holy shit, how can this be possible? Because he's not bleeding. How can he be shot and not bleeding? Because that doesn't make any sense. I don't know about you, but I picture getting shot and there being mad blood. But it turns out that when Hinckley shot this bullet, it hit the limousine in such a way that it flattened it to the shape and size of a dime, the thickness of a dime. So then that dime shaped bullet went in under his arm and just made this little slit, so it didn't really bleed. All it did is it went inside and tore up his insides real bad and hit a bunch of arteries and caused a bunch of internal bleeding, but not external bleeding. So doctors put a test tube in to expand his lung and get the blood out. And when they do that, they see that there's a lot of blood in his chest. They keep feeding it through the tube, and they see that the blood just keeps coming and coming. So they don't know what's going to happen at this point, but they know that it doesn't look good. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, the remaining Secret Service men that are still there have one main objective, and that's to get John, get him under control, get his weapons away from him, and make sure there's no other shooters, because you don't know if John's working with somebody. You don't know who this guy is. So they get him to the ground or whatever. They make sure he's not a threat, and then they start, giving aid to their other fallen members, the two Secret Service guys and the cop from DC that got shot. And it's just chaos there because most people had never been in a situation like this. So the energy there was just out of control. So the Secret Service takes John into custody, and they shove him into a police car with, Secret Service men on each side of him, flanking him, as they say, and they order the police officer to drive to the police station, obviously. And while they're driving, John is really quiet. He's really stoic. It seems like he's really letting it sink in that this actually happened. Yes, bro, this is real. You really did this. And then it was weird because halfway through their drive to the police station, John finally spoke. And when he did speak, it seemed like he really had a disconnect from reality here, because he asks the officers in the car if they know the score to a college basketball game that had been playing that day. And the driver is fucking irritated and is I don't know the fucking score, bro. What the fuck? Why would you ask me this? Anyways, John Hinckley, the Secret Service agents, they arrive at the DC headquarters where they already have homicide detectives, even though nobody is dead at this point, right? They already have homicide detectives there ready to question him. And they brought him here because they thought this would be like the safest place, the most, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but like a neutral ground. They thought that this would be because they were really worried that this shooting was going to cause a bunch of conspiracy theorists to come out and that they were going to think that John Hinckley didn't act alone or that he didn't act at all or he was manipulated by the government. They were really thinking about the Kennedy assassination, which is like a whole nother can of worms and a whole nother case, and probably one that I don't really see myself covering. So once they had John sat down in the station for questioning, there was a bit of like internal battle between, you know, the agencies, because there was the Secret Service there, but there was also the DC police, and the Secret Service agents had been shot, and so had the president, but well, they don't even know the president's shot at this point back where John is, but John had also shot a DC police officer. So the DC police is like, listen, we have jurisdiction, this was done in our area, we want to take him immediately right now. And the Secret Service is like, listen, like that sucks. It sucks to suck, but like you're not going to take him anywhere because we need to talk to him. Obviously, he just tried to assassinate the president. Like, they didn't care about jurisdiction. And I didn't look into this fully. I didn't look into this at all, actually. But if I'm just thinking about it, I imagine that Secret Service would, like, have jurisdiction. Like, jurisdiction aside, I think Secret Service would probably trump local police, but I don't really know for sure. Anyway, John's in custody, and it doesn't take authorities long. It doesn't take authorities long? I guess that is the right sentence, so it doesn't sound right. It doesn't take authorities long to identify him as John Hinckley Jr. because he had a wallet, he had identification on him. And it didn't take them long to discover what his motive was, because in his wallet alone he had, you know, several photos of Jodie, and he told them, like, listen, if you want to know why I did what I did, go to my hotel room because there is a letter there where I wrote everything down. So they do go there and they find this letter. They also find bullets, a VHS tape of Taxi Driver, and a postcard that John had written out to Jodie that said many things, but one of the things that it said was, quote, Jodie, you are a virgin, aren't you? And poor Jodie, man, getting all wrapped up in this when she had nothing to do with this. She was just this like young woman at the height of her career going off to college to try to better herself and give her like options. And then this creep does this. And she has no idea this has happened. Apparently she hadn't been watching the news. She didn't even know that the president had like an assassination attempt until the FBI calls her and is like, hey, we want to talk to you about this guy who's been sending you letters and calling you and shit, right? Because they find out about this through the letter. And that's when she finds out that this creep tried to assassinate the president for her. Now, how the situation affected her life and her personal life is unclear. She's a pretty private person, but it clearly, you know, didn't affect her career at all. I mean, she's very famous, and for a time she was like uber famous. She has 2 Oscars under her belt and has been in several great movies. Silence of the Lambs, Panic Room, Flight Plan, and Inside Man are a few of my favorites. And whether it's because of this happening or not, I can't be sure, but Jodie Foster has always been like a pretty private celebrity. She isn't in the media a ton. She hasn't done many interviews. She's not like one of those people who's always being interviewed, and she hasn't talked about this situation very much at all. The few times she has, she just said that it was a very scary experience, that it was a traumatizing experience, but that she didn't want this experience in her life to define her. So police go to his hotel, as I said, they find all that stuff. They also go to his home in Colorado, where they find a bunch of news articles about other assassinations. So though he says that this was like divine intervention because Reagan just happened to be where he was at the same time, it's clear he had also been planning this for a while. And John Hinckley later has come out and given interviews and said that he believes this is because at this time he was sinking deeper and deeper into his depression and his mental health was just like at an all-time low. So back at the station, they are questioning him, and he's answering their questions. He's open, he's willing to talk, and he has some questions of his own. He asks investigators if the Oscars were postponed, because yes, it was also Oscars time when this happened, which, if you're wondering, yes, he did see this as like a weird divine intervention thing as well. And he also asks investigators if he was successful. If he was successful in shooting the president. And to answer the question, was he successful? I guess the answer is yes and no, right? Like, did he shoot Reagan? Yes. But did he kill him? No, because he was still alive. He was in bad shape, but he was alive. So he had been moved to surgery, and the surgery room was packed, dude. Like I've told you, there were so many people around him when his gurney was moved from like the original room to the surgery room. There were like 30 people on either side, like flocking him, a sea of scrubs. And can you imagine being in this hospital at this time? You're like, man, I've really been waiting here like fucking 4 hours, because you know how long it takes when you go to the emergency room, and now every single doctor is working on this one person. You probably don't know it's the president because they're not going to announce that. It just sounds absolutely crazy. Pandemonium, as some may say. So they're operating on his chest and they're trying to find this bullet because they know he's been shot, but where's the bullet? They don't know. It's a game of literally a game of operation. So they're doing it. And what they're worried is going to happen is that this bullet, this little, dime-sized bullet, is going to slip into an artery, then be shot into his brain and kill him, which I did not know was a thing, but now I do, and that's horrifying. So they're working. And one of the guys, not the main doctor, but like the doctor's assistant, the guy who's helping him, reaches into Reagan's chest, cups his beating heart in his hands. What a story for your drinking buddies, am I right? Moves it to the side. And then the surgeon's able to find the bullet. The bullet was lodged in his chest like an inch away from his heart. They remove it and they're able to repair all the damage. It's just wild, dude. He was 70 years old. He's shot in the chest. The bullet goes through his lung, lodges itself an inch away from his heart. He loses half the blood in his body, and he survives. I just imagine being him. He's got all this internal bleeding. He's in pain. He's having trouble breathing. He's lying naked in front of a group of people, right? But he was said to just have like a very good sense of humor, even in this situation. Like when his wife Nancy finally got to the hospital and was able to see him, his first words to her were, quote, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And I guess at one point during all of this that was going on, Reagan like looked out to the sea of people and was like, I hope you're all Republicans, because like Reagan was a Republican. And the surgeon, who by the way was not a Republican, just looked at him and was like, sir, today we're all Republicans. After 11 days, Reagan was released from the hospital and he went back to the White House where he could, finish his recovery. And he did recover quickly. But before he got back to the White House and when this was first all happening, it was in complete chaos. They were spiraling. They had no idea what was going on. They had no idea how serious things were. They had no idea the condition of Reagan, who John Hinckley even was. So they didn't have answers to questions, but they gave a press conference anyway, because apparently that's just what you do. But they didn't look good because they had no fucking idea what was going on. Man, and once they did learn what was going on, can you even imagine how intense that would be to learn that this 25-year-old man had tried to kill the president because he was obsessed with a child actress? Like, so sensational. Nobody had that on their 1981 bingo card. You know what I mean? Like, most people believed that a presidential assassination attempt would be politically motivated. Like, maybe John Hinckley hated Republicans like Elena from Billy on the Street. But no. Anyways, a little more than a year after the assassination attempt, on May 1st, 1982, John Hinckley Jr. went to trial, and he was being tried for 13 different offenses. And John Hinckley Jr. pled not guilty by reason of insanity, because really, like, that's all he could do, right? Like, everyone knew he did it. He was seen doing it. He was even caught on video doing it. Oh, and fun fact, because when I learned this, I thought this was a fact that was, in fact, fun. Cool. One of John Hinckley's attorneys during his trial was actually one of Bill Clinton's attorneys during his impeachment trial. And I thought that was a fun fact. So, the more you know. Anyways, an expert witness did testify for the defense and said that John Hinckley Jr. was, in fact, mentally ill at the time of the assassination attempt. They said that John was becoming obsessed with the movie Taxi Driver and that he had delusions and was forming false beliefs, where he believed that him and De Niro were kind of morphing into the same person, and that he, John Hinckley, wanted to save Jodie Foster the same way that De Niro wanted to save Jodie Foster's character in the movie, and that he truly believed that this was real and this was true, and said that in addition to that, John Hinckley Jr. had an array of mental health conditions, including schizophrenia, and couldn't separate reality from fiction. Now, what's wild here, or maybe not so wild, depending on how you look at things, because I don't know what your opinion is after a 2-month trial and 3 hours of deliberation, John Hinckley Jr. was found to be not guilty by reason of insanity. He was diagnosed with 5 mental health disorders, including schizotypal personality, borderline personality, narcissistic personality, major depression, and schizoid personality. And he was also found to have, quote, serious defects in reality testing, insight, and judgment, making him an unpredictably dangerous person. Now, people were outraged that he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. They felt like he was, getting away with attempted murder, like he was getting off easy. But in reality, if we're very honest, he probably ended up serving more time in a mental health facility than he ever would for attempted murder, because attempted murder sentences are an absolute fucking joke. Like, they truly are. And I don't know if it would have been different because one of the people he tried to kill was the president. I don't know if that's an aggravating factor for more time. I don't know the law around that. But the fact is, he did attempt to kill 4 people and eventually was considered to be guilty of murdering one of them. So let me get into all that while I go through what happened to the other men that were shot. So let's quickly start with Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan made a full recovery, right? I said that. He recovered pretty quickly, but he was said to suffer from pain for years. And Ronald Reagan actually died. He died on June 5th, 2004, and this was 10 years after announcing that he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. So I really feel for him. Like, that's a nasty disease, and I feel for anybody who has to go out that way, because like, it's a very, if you've ever looked into it or ever experienced it, like I had a family member who died that way, it is a nasty way to go. Next, Tom Delahunty. He was the DC police officer, you know, the one that wasn't in the Secret Service, that just happened to be there helping guard the president. He heard the shots, turned towards the president, and got hit in the back of the neck with the bullet ricocheting off his spine. After he was shot, he was taken to the Washington Hospital Center, and the doctors wore bulletproof vests, dude, when they removed the bullet from his neck, because they learned that the bullets that were used were the Devastator brand cartridges, and basically these cartridges contain like small explosive devices that were made to explode on impact. So they're wearing bulletproof vests in case, like, when they're removing them, they explode. And luckily, in his case, that did not happen. The bullet was removed without incident, and after 11 days in the hospital, he was released, and he said that at the time he felt good, he was ready to go. Next, there was Tim McCarthy. He's a Secret Service agent who, like, stood there and spread his arms and, like, bared his chest to protect the president, and was, because of that shot in the chest, and the bullet went through his lung, his liver, and his diaphragm. He was taken to the same hospital as the president, and he was operated on for 2 hours, but he too made a full recovery. He was considered a hero and was given awards for his act of bravery, and went on to become the chief of the Orland Police Department, and retired actually in 2020. I watched an interview with him talking about his retirement. He was so sad to retire. I don't know much about him, but I just felt so sad to see, like, this man retiring. He just was very emotional, which makes me emotional because I am a water sign and a bit of an empath, if you believe in empaths. I don't know if I believe in empaths, but if they exist, let me tell you I am one, because everything you feel, if I'm next to you, I do be feeling it. Then we have Jim Brady. He was 40 years old, and he was the White House press secretary, and he definitely got the worst of this. So when he was shot, the bullet entered his head. It went into his skull above his left eye and lodged into his brain and shattered his brain cavity. And you remember how I said that these bullets were, you know, the type that would explode on impact? Well, his did. His was the only bullet that exploded, and his was in his head. So he, along with Tim McCarthy, were actually taken to the same hospital as Reagan, and he was in surgery for hours with them trying to save his life. And during his time, the news was, during this time, the news was wild, dude. They had actually reported on the news that Jim Brady had died, and he was still in surgery at this time, and the surgeon was told, like, while doing surgery, that the news was saying that he died, and the surgeon was just like, wow, you know, I didn't know he had died yet, like, his eyes just rolling in the back of his head. And Jim Brady did not die. He did survive for more than 3 decades after he was shot, but his life was, like, completely changed, dude. He was left partially paralyzed, using a wheelchair full time. He had trouble controlling his emotions, often cry-talking for a while, and had issues with memory and thinking, and had trouble recognizing people that he knew. He wasn't even able to, like, perform his duties as the White House press secretary, but they didn't, like, take his job away from him, even though he couldn't, like, actually do it. He stayed on until the end of the Reagan administration, and other people just did the actual work for him. Now, as I said, Jim Brady did live another 30 years, over 30 years after being shot, but he did die. He died on August 4th, 2014 at the age of 73. And what's wild here is the medical examiner who, you know, performed the autopsy and determined his cause of death, manner of death, all that jazz, ruled his manner of death as a homicide due to the gunshot that he sustained, like the gunshot wound that he sustained in 1981. And I always find that to be so, well, I say always, like, it happens so much. I've only actually ever read about one other case where that was the determination. It's one that I didn't cover. I read about it years ago, and it was like, it's a really messed up case where this lady, like, shook a baby, like, decades earlier, and the baby, like, grew up and had problems its whole life, and then as an adult ended up dying, and the woman ended up being charged. Did she end up being charged? They determined that the cause of death was due to the shaking, so it was considered a homicide. And that's what happened here as well. And I find it to be so wild that you can make that determination after so many years. I don't know how they do it. And it's not like they did this just to like keep Hinckley behind bars, because they couldn't do that. They could not give him more time or keep him in custody longer because of Jim Brady's death being ruled a homicide, because prosecution for him for that crime was barred under the year and a day law that was in effect. And that is exactly how it sounds. Quote, a person cannot be convicted of homicide for a death that occurs more than a year and a day after his or her acts that allegedly caused it, end quote. So John couldn't be held responsible for this. I just find the whole thing, the whole determination with Jim Brady's shooting is just so wild to me. Oh, and one more thing about Jim Brady. You may have heard of the Brady Act. Well, in 1993, Jim Brady and his wife Sarah helped pass the Brady Act, which ushered in a waiting period and background check when getting guns. Because, dude, when John bought his guns back in the 80s, there was nothing. They didn't have to run a background check. They didn't have to check his mental health. They didn't have a waiting period. Nothing. He was able to just walk into a Texas pawn shop and buy the 6-shooter. So, this attempted murder of Tim, Tom, Jim, and Reagan. Why are they all first names and Reagan is a last name? Due to the attempted murder of these men, the gun control laws were tightened. They were made better, obviously, we see that now. And also, a lot of states ended up tightening up their parameters around the insanity defense, because remember, John Hinckley Jr. was found not guilty by reason of insanity. So, John was placed in a mental health facility, the St. Elizabeth's Medical Center, for an indeterminate amount of time. Like, he wasn't going to get to just go free. He'd have to be there until he was deemed not to be a risk. And he was there for about 6 months. Like, he was in the hospital for about 6 months before the enormity of what he did came into focus. And he realized that, like, this was real. This is serious. And his real recovery began. But it was a slow recovery, right? He was still suffering from delusions. He was still, like, violently depressed. He did try to take his own life by, like, hoarding his medication and taking a lot of antidepressants. And he was still obsessed with Jodie. He did get found. There were photos of Jodie found, like, stored in his room. And in 1982, he wrote of this quote, "My greatest fear is finding out that Jodie is getting married to someone else." Like, his obsession and his delusions did not stop just when he was put in the hospital. It wasn't like magic. He was still fixated on her. He would still write her letters all the time. Some that he would send, some that he wouldn't, which I don't understand why he would get to send any of them. That seems absolutely crazy to me. Like, maybe he thought he sent them and they got confiscated on the way out. He said that he sent some, but I can't imagine that they would let him actually send those to her. But he said that this was his way of, like, not feeling lonely. One of these letters that he did send out, like this one I know did actually make it off the hospital grounds, was not sent to Jodie, but was instead sent to the Times. And he said in this letter, in part, quote, "The shooting outside the Washington Hilton Hotel was the greatest love offering in the history of the world. At one time, Miss Foster was a star, and I was the insignificant fan. Now everything has changed. I am Napoleon, and she is Josephine. I am Romeo, and she is Juliet." Now, it appears that at least at the beginning of his stay in the mental hospital, he was trying to convince the doctors that he was well instead of actually trying to be well. Twice he tried to, like, go to court or tried to, like, convince the people that he needed to convince that he was, like, mentally healthy enough to be released. But when they did a little investigation into him, they found out, like, when they looked into him, like, should we let him out? They looked into what he had been doing. They found that he had been doing some pretty sketch stuff, like requesting a new drawing of Jodie Foster, like calling Charles Manson a cool dude and a great prophet, and corresponding with Ted Bundy. They also found some writings in his journal from 1987, so a couple of years after he had been put into the hospital, where he said, quote, "Psychiatry is a guessing game, and I do my best to keep the fools guessing about me. They will never know the true John Hinckley. Only I fully understand myself." Which the final part of that sentence is true. We only fully understand ourselves, but, like, trying to trick the hospitals when you're in there for what you did, like, maybe you just get better. Maybe. During his stay in the hospital, he also developed a small obsession on another woman. It wasn't, like, super serious. We're gonna get into it right now. Like, and what's super weird about it is he actually had a girlfriend at this time, which we are gonna get into as well. And even though he had a girlfriend, he ended up developing a little bit of an obsession on a hospital pharmacist named Jeanette. And I guess his girlfriend at the time was like, it's good, like, go ahead, be friends with her, like, encouraged it. And it started innocently enough. Like,
She would come in, she would tell him like what books to read, and she taught him how to crochet, and he would go in and visit her like a couple times a week and they would chat. But after a while, it escalated and it got out of hand. He started coming by all the time. He started calling her over and over. Sometimes he'd call her up to 15 times a day and just like hang up. And it got to the point that she told him like, okay, this is too much and I need you to stay away. And mostly he did. He did end up sending her a package after that, even though she told him like not to contact her anymore, but it wasn't too much. It wasn't like crazy obsessive like he had been with Jodie. And they actually even did a review into this situation because they're like, if this guy's still getting obsessed with women, like this is a problem. But they actually determined during this review that he wasn't delusional in like his interest in this woman, that she had been like playing a part in it. And he even said that this situation was caused by faulty judgment on Jeanette's part. So those are just some bullet points about his stay in the hospital, because we clearly couldn't cover all of it. He was there a long time. He was there for years, for decades, until finally he wasn't. Now, it doesn't seem like this came out of nowhere, because he was in the hospital for more than 30 years. But over the time of being in the hospital, he was slowly given more freedom. Like first he was allowed to go out for a little bit of time during the day. Then he was allowed to do overnights, and he was allowed to do weekends, until finally he was spending more time at his mother's house than at the hospital. He was given a conditional driver's license and a GPS monitored cell phone so that they could track him, but they had to like observe him and see how he would be out of the hospital. And it is a really tricky situation, because like it's scary to think of somebody like that being released, but at the same time, how are you going to know if a person can be safe outside of the hospital walls if you're not observing them living with the stressors of life outside of the hospital walls, right? It's a tricky situation. But those who worked at the hospital and knew him over the years said that he was just great. They said he was sweet and he was considerate, and that nobody should be worried about him being free because he's not a danger to anyone. They said he's a painter and he's a musician, that he volunteers at the library, which I believe was something he had to do. Like it wasn't a conditional thing or an unconditional thing. He was told he had to work at the library, but everyone who came in contact with him said that he was just like a really sweet, great, and polite guy. He never caused any trouble. When he was released, his attorney, Barry Levine, made a statement where he said, like, John had gone a very long time without getting into any trouble. His disease was in full remission, his disease being psychosis and major depression. And he said there have been multiple risk assessments, and he had been deemed not a risk. He was taking medication to combat his anxiety and to prevent psychosis, and he'll be required to meet with a psychiatrist and a therapist. So in 2016, John Hinckley Jr. was granted release into the custody of his mother, who lived in Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. And his family was said to be very supportive of him. Like his mom and dad from day one were on his side and took care of him until the day that they died. And then after they died, his siblings stood by him. And this had to be really hard, because I read that his father took a lot of guilt, like really blamed himself for what happened and felt like he should have been able to do more to like help his son not get to that point. And John's mother and father actually became real champions for mental health awareness, and his father set up the American Mental Health Fund to try to raise money to research mental illness. So that was in 2016. He was released to his mother, but it was like a conditional release. He still had to see doctors, go to therapists. He was still like monitored in some way. But then in June of 2022, John Hinckley Jr. was granted full release, which is essentially total freedom. Like he's just a totally normal, totally free person. And I believe he's still living in Virginia. And by this time, like he is alone because both of his parents have died. Since being fully released, he has done his fair share of interviews. He has come out and said that he is totally for gun control. He thinks that there are too many guns in the country as there are. He says he read a statistic that said there are more guns in the country than there are actual people. And he said that like waiting periods and background checks, which were put in effect because of what he did, are great, but he still thinks that there are far too many guns in the country as a whole, and believes, of course, that like mentally ill people should not have access to guns. He has said that he doesn't really remember what he was thinking or what he was feeling around the time of the shooting. He says at that point he was far too disconnected from reality. He has also said, though, that or acknowledged that it could be that he just doesn't want to remember those things, which I guess is fair. He says that all he really remembers from that time leading up to the shooting was that he felt incredibly isolated and incredibly depressed. He just said that he felt really cut off from society and by himself, and he was estranged from his family, and all of that together just had a crippling feeling, just gave him like a crippling feeling of isolation.
And he said that at that time, he wholeheartedly believed that killing Ronald Reagan would impress Jodie Foster. Like, he truly felt that and believed it in his soul. And he said saying it now and hearing himself say it now in that kind of thought process, he realizes that it's completely ridiculous. He said that he was sorry to the Reagan family, he was sorry to the Brady family, etc., etc. He was sorry to Jodie Foster for bringing her into that. He was just so sorry. And he didn't think that they would forgive him and they would be fine in not doing so, but it didn't change how sorry he was. And he said that he always wanted to apologize, that for years he wanted to apologize. But before he was given his unconditional release, he was legally barred from contacting his victims. Now, despite the fact that John was never able to actually apologize legally, like he wasn't legally allowed to apologize, Reagan was said to actually forgive him. He was said to want to go and visit John Hinckley and look him in the eyes and shake his hand and tell him, I forgive you. But he was advised by the White House physician and also a group of psychiatrists that worked with John Hinckley not to do that because, quote, Hinckley was a twisted sociopath, egotistical, and would misinterpret Reagan's gesture. John Hinckley said that he is glad that he did not succeed with his mission. And I watched him in an interview talking about this. And when he said this, you could see his body physically react. He said that at that point in his life, he didn't have a good heart and he wasn't a good person because he wasn't doing things that a good person would do. But he did say that he believes that his ruling at trial and his subsequent release was justice because he's not a cold-blooded killer. He was just a sick young man who had lost touch with reality and didn't know right from wrong. When asked how he feels about Jodie Foster now, because I'm sure you're kind of curious about that, I know I was, he just said that he has good feelings towards her and wishes her a good life. When asked if he considers himself to be like Mark David Chapman, who is the man who murdered John Lennon, who is still in jail, by the way, John Hinckley has said that no, he doesn't consider them to be the same because he, not Mark David Chapman, was found to be mentally ill, right? He was found not guilty because he was mentally ill, and Mark David Chapman was not. He said he wants people to know that now he is just an ordinary guy who's just trying to get along with everybody else, but everyone just thinks he's a crazy person, and he's not anymore. He said that he takes his medications because he believes that they help, and he said that he doesn't think he needs them anymore, but still takes them because he knows he should and wants to be safe. He says that he truly believes, and he is proof of the fact that the criminally insane can be cured. John Hinckley had a long-term partner while he was in the hospital. Her name is Leslie DeVeau, and they were together a long time. I think they were together 2 decades. They were engaged to be married. It was a really big deal. And he credits her a lot to his recovery. Her and the fact that the two of them rescued and took care of cats. And he said of this relationship, quote, I was lost until I found Leslie, and everything changed from the day I met her. Leslie made me want to live again, and she is now the sunshine of my life. Now, Leslie. When I tell you, that is another rabbit hole that I went down. Holy shit. So, John and Leslie met in the hospital, the same hospital. He was in there for trying to kill Ronald Reagan due to his delusions, and Leslie was in there for murdering her own daughter due to hers. Now, that is a whole nother story. That is a whole nother case. If you want me to cover it in a separate video, leave it in the comments because it is absolutely wild, but it is far too long. This video is so long that I can't include it here. So if you want a separate video on Leslie DeVeau and the murder of her daughter, let me know in the comments, but wow. But I will tell you what I know right now about John Hinckley, or a little bit. I'll give you a little bit on John Hinckley and Leslie's relationship since he credits her for his recovery. So John met Leslie, who was 10 years older than him while they were both in the hospital, and they were in adjacent wards. They weren't together because probably because male and female. That sounds right. It could be wrong, but they were in adjacent wards. So when they first started talking, their communication was really limited. They would just write letters back and forth, and they wouldn't talk about much, just basically what was going on in their day because their letters were monitored, especially John Hinckley's at this time. The two grew closer despite not seeing each other and only communicating through letters, and eventually John told Leslie that he loved her like a sister, and she kissed him on the cheek during a Christmas party where the wards were together. Now, the two ended up getting even closer in early 1983, and this is when Leslie learned that John had, attempted to take his own life when he hoarded all those pills and the antidepressants and took them. He was in really bad shape. He was on a respirator, and this is because he had finally started to come to the realization that his delusions were not real. And this was incredibly jarring and incredibly difficult for him, which is why he tried to take his own life. And Leslie said that she could like relate to that because she knew what that felt like from when that happened to her as well. So he recovers, he gets out of the hospital, and the first thing he does is lets Leslie know that he's okay. And from there, the two's relationship really got a lot stronger. They were the reason that the other got out of bed every day, and they started telling each other that they loved each other. So from there, Leslie at this point had more freedoms. Her stay in the hospital was a lot shorter than John's. Like, wow, so much shorter, like wildly shorter. But because she had more freedom, she was allowed to like walk around the grounds. Even though they were in separate wards, she was able to like walk over to his building. She couldn't go in, but she would go and stand on the ground below his window and like call up to him. And he was on the 4th floor, and the two would just talk. And John was mostly pretty reclusive with other people in the hospital. Like, he wouldn't really talk to them. But with Leslie, they would talk for hours. And it got to the point that the spot that she would stand, like under his window to talk to him, the ground was worn from her being there so often for so long. They didn't get to see each other in person very much, but every 3 months or so, they would be able to see each other and have sort of like a day date or whatever, because the men's ward and the women's ward would get together for like a dance and socializing situation, which Leslie talked about how it was very, very odd, and like the women felt like they were just kind of being handed out to these men. That's a whole other thing, and I'm not even going to get into that, but they would get to see each other, and they would get all dressed up and all ready, and then they would just sit and talk like the entire time while everybody else was socializing and dancing. In 1983, the two took their relationship to the next level, and it was actually on John's 28th birthday when he proposed to Leslie. Now, she says that this didn't feel like a real proposal, like neither of them really thought they were going to get married, but it was just something to hold on to when you had nothing else going on in your life. And she said for her, she just felt like she needed somebody to mother because her only child she had killed her only child. She said that, quote, her arms ached. And she said that she loved that somebody loved her despite all her ugliness. So with that, John took like a bread bag tie, you know, a little twisty thing, and fashioned it into an engagement ring and gave it to Leslie. Now, eventually Leslie was released, and once she was released, they weren't able to see each other, you know, as often, and she would call him, and she'd come and see him on the weekends, and they could see each other for like 30 minutes at a time, but there was always a table between them. And that lasted until 1986, when John was granted his first, like, release, like his first time that he was able to leave the hospital, where he was able to go home for like a social gathering for Christmas. And from there, they'd continue to have more visits. Once John was awarded more unsupervised freedoms, they'd spend time together, and Leslie actually played an active role in his legal defense as well. Like, it was weird. It was super weird. Like, his family wasn't super stoked about that. His dad wasn't, but she would help with the legal stuff, and she would even pay some of his legal fees. And the two had plans, like, for their future together. They planned to, like, once he was released, they were going to move in together, but they were going to get apartments with, like, an adjoining door because they liked their own space, so they wanted to be in 2 separate spaces. And then he would get, like, a job at a bookstore or playing music while she worked at a hospital. But that wasn't in the cards for them because the relationship actually ended in 2004 before John was ever released. Leslie was said to be the one who ended the relationship. She said that she couldn't deal with the scrutiny of being John Hinckley Jr.'s girlfriend, his fiance. She didn't want to be in the public eye in that way, and John was said to be very respectful of her decision to end the relationship and wasn't obsessive at all. He was fine with just being friends. So now he lives alone with his cat named Theo, who he says is his best friend, and he says that he works super hard every day to maintain his mental health and to be a contributing member to society. And he says that he feels like his best way that he can give back to society is through his art and through his music. He hopes to have a career as a singer and songwriter, and he actually did book some shows. Like, he had some shows at separate venues that he was going to play, but none of the shows ended up going through. There were like several of them where it was planned, but they ended up being canceled due to safety concerns and just general outrage from the public. So now he actually has a YouTube channel, which he's been posting to for about 2 years now, and it's just him and his music. And he thinks that people listening to these songs and listening to the music he makes is a way that they can see who he really is. Now, people are definitely split on if they think he should have been released. Some people are like, yeah, you know, he served his time, he shouldn't. And other people are like, no, he should never be released. He hasn't even known any real punishment. He was literally allowed to just like roam the corridors and roam the grounds of this hospital and go to parties and have girlfriends. Like, how is that a punishment? Tim McCarthy, the Secret Service agent who stood and got shot in the chest when he protected the president, said that he was very surprised and disappointed to see that John Hinckley was given complete unconditional release because this man almost killed him. This man almost made his wife a widow and took him away from his children. But he did say that he is a Christian, so he does not want revenge. He said that this was a mass shooting because Jim Brady was murdered, and though he didn't die that day, he never recovered from his injuries. He was paralyzed for the rest of his life, and eventually he died decades later as a result of the shooting that day. And this death was ruled a homicide, which is so sad, and I haven't really seen John Hinckley say much about that. I did see one interview where he was asked about this. John Hinckley was interviewed by Piers Morgan, and he was asked about Jim Brady and the fact that he died, and it was ruled to be a homicide. And you do see John react physically to this. He takes in this shaky sigh, and it was notable to me. It didn't feel like acting. But when he acknowledges this, when he talks about it and he talks about the fact that Jim Brady died and his death was ruled a homicide, he says that he acknowledges that Jim being shot all those years before did contribute to his death, but he doesn't consider himself to be a murderer because of the fact that Jim Brady went on to live another 30 years. But back to Tim McCarthy. He said what he takes, his biggest takeaway from this is the fact that this man tried to kill the president, not anybody else, that he tried to kill the most powerful, most important man, in the country. And for him to try to kill the president and then get to be released, he said that he doesn't want to question the judge who made this decision because this judge knows more than him, knows Hinckley's history, talked to the doctors, etc., but said that they better have gotten it right because he doesn't like the idea of setting the tone that you can take a shot at the president and the most intense hammer won't be brought down upon you. He said with John's release, though, he doesn't fear for his safety or his family's safety, and that it would just be a very bad idea for John Hinckley to show up on his doorstep. Ronald Reagan's daughter, Patty Davis, did release a statement at the time when she heard that, John Hinckley was being fully released, where she said, quote, "Now Hinckley's last restrictions have been lifted. He can now, if he wants, contact me, my siblings, and the actress Jodie Foster, whom, as is well known, he was trying to impress by carrying out his ambush." And there does even seem to be some split feelings on Hinckley's full freedom, even within the Reagan family, because his son Michael tweeted after John Hinckley was released saying, quote, "FYI, my father forgave Hinckley and would approve, therefore, so do I." So it's just sticky, right? That's got to be awkward in the family too, right? To have two siblings on opposite sides of that. But his daughter just says, she tried to kill my father, and I can't forget about those cold eyes. And she is right in saying that, he could go see her because now legally he could go and he could try to apologize. He could do whatever he wants to do because he is a free man. But in interviews, he has said he has no intention of doing that he doesn't think he'd want to see them, and he just wants to let everybody have their peace. And I do truly hope that all of them in some way have found peace in this. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing a woman named Leslie DeVeau. Now, Leslie DeVeau was the fiance of a man named John Hinckley Jr., and John Hinckley Jr. was the man who attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan in order to impress actress Jodie Foster, who we covered last week. Now, Leslie and John met while they were institutionalized due to their separate crimes, and Leslie's crime was intense. Leslie even said in an interview that she believes that people will see her as a more dangerous monster than people saw John Hinckley Jr. And that's because in 1982, Leslie murdered her 10-year-old daughter before trying and failing to take her own life. And now with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the murder of Erin DeVeau at the hands of her own mother, Leslie DeVeau. Our story today begins on March 18th, 1982, and this is in Friendship Heights, which was in a nice upscale neighborhood where, it was very, very picturesque. All the men knew each other. They waxed their cars in the front yards and had barbecues, and the women would go out and go shopping and gossiping together. And all the kids were friends with all the other kids. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone was very tight-knit. It was on this day at about 6:15 p.m. when a group of women went over to this nicely manicured home. It was a 2-story brick home on 45th Street that was owned by the DeVeaus. And the DeVeaus were Anthony, who went by Tony, the father, Leslie, the mother, and their one child, a daughter named Erin. Now, these women were going over there because they had been trying to get a hold of their friend Leslie. They'd been trying to get a hold of her all day. First, they started calling her over and over on the phone, but every time they tried to call, the line was busy. And then they had even went over to the home earlier in the evening, like before sundown, to try to get a hold of Leslie because they had, not an appointment, a social appointment, sure. They were going to get together and play tennis, and Leslie was supposed to go, but she wasn't answering the phone, and when they went over to the house, nobody was there, so now they were going back again because they still couldn't get a hold of her. So anyway, when they couldn't get a hold of her the first time they went to her house, they just went off to play tennis thinking, I don't know, maybe she'll show up. Maybe there's an explanation. Who knows? Let's go play some tennis. But they got there, they played tennis, and she never showed up. So like, that's kind of weird, especially for Leslie, which we'll get into because people have been a little bit worried about her in general. So they go back to the house again. It's about 6:15 p.m. They knock on the doors again because they had done this before. They had knocked, they had tried to even open the door, but everything was locked. And when they went this time again, there was no sign of life inside. Nobody was making any noise. The only thing inside, creature, sure, inside that was making any sort of noise was the family's dog, a little cocker spaniel named Daisy, who was inside barking and like scratching against the window pane, obviously wanting some like attention. So fearing that something may be wrong, the women decide that they are going to get inside that house. So they go to a nearby neighbor that they know had like a spare key. They convince this neighbor to let them in, and they go inside to start, investigating, see what's going on. And they call out to Leslie, like, Leslie, are you here? And to their surprise, they do get a response. Leslie does yell back, but she tells them to go away. But they're like, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. So they're moving around the house, and one woman makes her way upstairs and into an upstairs bedroom, and this is where she finds just a horrible scene. She finds Leslie laying on a blood-soaked mattress. There are blood stains everywhere, and lying beside her on the bed is a 12-gauge shotgun. And the worst side of all was the fact that Leslie's arm had been like, for lack of a better word, like blown off. It was nearly severed. But she was alive and she was alert, and she spoke to this woman and said words that nobody would ever expect to hear. And these words were, quote, I shot Erin. And Erin was her 10-year-old daughter, her only child, and she had been killed in this failed murder-suicide. Okay, so now let's talk about a little bit of backstory. Now, there isn't a ton of information on Leslie and her early life from what I could find. Leslie herself hasn't done many interviews. I think there was only like one big interview that I was able to find to get some information from her point of view. Because again, for whatever reason, this case just wasn't publicized much. Not even on newspapers.com. And that's the part that blows my mind, because you can find everything on newspapers.com. But somehow this case completely went under the radar, which is very strange. But what I was able to find out is that Leslie was born Leslie Ann Lockwood. And I know that after she graduated high school, she went to a super small university in Delaware before transferring to George Washington University when her father ended up having to be hospitalized because he was dealing with a pretty severe bout of mental illness. It was while attending George Washington University that Leslie would meet a man named Anthony Harold DeVeau, who went by Tony. The two were actually set up on a blind date in 1962, and clearly the date went well because a few short years later, in October of 1967, the two married, and then they went on their honeymoon in the Caribbean. Caribbean? It's Caribbean when it's the place, but it's Caribbean when we're talking pirates, right? Right. But anyway, that is where they went on their honeymoon. The two then settled down in what they believed would be their forever home in 1969. And this was a 2-story brick home located at 5112 45th Street Northwest in Friendship Heights. A picturesque place, a perfect place to raise a family. It's very much what you picture in your head when when they portray America in movies, everything is bright and colorful and everything's like perfectly manicured. That's what this place, it's called Friendship Heights. What are you expecting, right? Friendship Heights in the 60s, the late 60s, early 70s, it's exactly what you picture in your head. Pleasantville, when it's in color. When the couple moved into this neighborhood, they were welcomed with open arms. They were the ideal couple. They fit in perfectly. They were both hot, right? They were both hot and blonde. He was tall and built, and she was short and teeny and petite with bleach blonde hair. And they were really big on socializing and hanging out with the neighbors, having their barbecues, camping, playing tennis, all the things. After some time, the family was seen as like a prominent family in the community. They even ended up being placed in the Washington's social register, the Green Book. The Green Book basically lists the most prominent people from Washington, from the ranks of business, law, government, philanthropy, technology, and more. And the only way you can actually get into this book is by invitation, and members are defined by their commitment to the community, family, or their profession. So basically, it's for all of the hoity-toities, and I believe you probably have to have a little bit of money too. So all of that is just to say that they were like a big deal in their community. Tony and Leslie were said to be happy. They were said to be the ideal couple, the perfect little, the people you strive to be like. And then they went on to be the perfect little parents. Like, they went on to have a daughter in 1972, their one and only child, a girl named Erin. And after they were a trio, a whole solidified family, even though you can be a family without kids, but once they had their child, they were seen as like the ideal little parents with child. That's that family dynamic. They were called by one neighbor the Brady Bunch. Obviously, they were missing a couple members in order to be the Brady Bunch, but they were seen as like very wholesome, just like that. Leslie was a very doting and like devoted mother, very like on top of her daughter, but in the best way. They had like a little bit of a friendship, and Erin was seen as like a happy and adorable little girl. And Anthony, of course, Tony, was seen as a very like involved father. He was praised for, showing up at his daughter's gymnastic meets, things like that. Now, I mentioned that the two only had one child, and this was Erin, but it seems like this wasn't due to a lack of trying. It's not like they only wanted and only tried for one child. This just seemed to be Leslie's only successful pregnancy. So this is a heavy case. I've already mentioned it. So if mental health and, I usually don't give trigger warnings, but I know that pregnancy in particular is a tough one, especially if you struggle in that area. So I'll just say that now that we're going to get into a little bit here. It's not like graphic or anything, but it's really, really, really sad. Like I've always felt this way, even before I had my child, even when I was still in the mindset of like, I never want to have kids. Because if you guys remember, I was like, I'm never having kids. Fucking joke's on me, right? With my little perfect angel boy. But I've always felt that not being able to have kids when you want them is like one of the saddest things. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. So I feel for Leslie too, because they, at least Tony, did want more kids and they did try. And Leslie suffered from a few miscarriages. I think she had 3, and it was really difficult and really traumatic for her. And that would be so, I cannot imagine. I could cry like just thinking about that, how traumatizing that would be. And it made Leslie like very afraid to continue trying to get pregnant, so she stopped. And it was also said that Leslie told a friend of hers at one point that she wondered if her body miscarrying was because deep down she really didn't want to have more kids, which makes the whole thing even more just sad. It's an overall sad situation. Anyways, moving from that big bummer of a paragraph to more bummers, because this whole case is a real big bummer. So prior to Erin being born, Leslie had gotten a full-time job with social services. She worked as a foster care person. You know what I mean? You know what I'm trying to say. An employee for foster care. So she did that for a while, but then once Erin was born, she decided that she didn't want to work full-time. So she left her full-time job and started doing independent contracting work. And she was doing work, basically working with abused kids that were suffering from child abuse, which she saw some of the worst things that a person could see. I cannot even imagine the type of things that you see when you have that type of job, especially considering some of the cases that I've covered. That kind of stuff destroys me, and it was said to really weigh on Leslie as well, which makes total sense. Now, a few years later, she was actually able to change positions, so she didn't do that work for a long time, though I'm sure 3 years in that sort of position is still like a long time and a lot to see. But she actually went back to school when Erin was 3, and she got her master's degree in social work, and from there she ended up getting a job working with geriatric patients, which I know is like the politically correct term to use, but like I hate that phrase. I don't know why, it just irritates me. Like, okay, for example, one of my friends got pregnant. She had her baby before I had Charlie, and during her pregnancy they called it a geriatric pregnancy because she was 35 when she got pregnant. And I'm like, 35 is geriatric? Like, ma'ams? Sirs? Are you serious? It just irritated me. Anyways, she got this job working with geriatric patients, but she didn't even last an entire year in this job because something I haven't mentioned yet, but something you've probably caught on to, is that Leslie was really struggling with her mental health, and it was affecting, all aspects of her life. And now whether she struggled with her mental health prior to getting pregnant, or if this was a result of getting pregnant and, suffering from postpartum depression, there's so many things that can happen when you have a baby that people just do not understand. It's wild to me. I talk to people sometimes that don't believe that even. I've talked to somebody who's like, oh, I don't believe postpartum depression exists. And I was like, I am freshly postpartum, and I can tell you for sure you are wrong. Obviously, there are different degrees of it and all that jazz, which we're not going to get into, and we have a much better understanding of it now than we did in the 80s. But all of that is to say that, to me, in my opinion, I think it was probably a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, because we know that Leslie's father suffered with his mental health, and we do know that that can also be genetic, but we do also know that she had had a baby and also miscarriages. There are a lot of factors that could have contributed to this, but in the years leading up to Erin's murder, Leslie was really struggling. Her depression was growing. She was experiencing feelings of uselessness, and she truly felt like she couldn't do anything right. And that's just incredibly sad to me, because when I read about Leslie, it seemed like she just had a ton going for her. She had a job that she worked hard to get. She had completed school, which is something that not everybody gets to do. An education is a wonderful thing to have the privilege to have. And she had this wonderful daughter, right? Erin was said to be fantastic. She was this cute, rambunctious, happy little blonde tomboy that everyone loved. All the kids wanted to be her friend, and all the parents were like, wow, you lucked out with such a great daughter. They were said to have a fantastic relationship. It was said to be almost perfect, an ideal mother-daughter relationship and friendship. They were said to have the type of relationship that the other kids were jealous of. Everyone was jealous of Erin. She got everything she wanted. She was always happy. She got to have pancakes and Fruit Loops every day for breakfast, and she got to have puppies, and they were just like, why can't I be Erin? Why can't my life be like Erin's? She gets anything that she wants. And adults thought that their relationship was great too, with one neighbor saying of their relationship, and I quote, "I always admired that relationship. I always thought she was a wonderful mother because she let Erin have stuff. I wish I could be that way." And obviously just letting your child have stuff and being able to eat Fruit Loops and pancakes isn't it doesn't make you mother of the year. But across the board later, there's a lot of interviews done with people that knew them, and everyone just said that she was a fantastic and loving and doting mother. Now, despite having this wonderful daughter, this wonderful life, Leslie struggled because mental illness, man, it doesn't matter. They don't care who you are. They don't care how much money you have. They don't care how great your life is. Depression is an entity. It can feel like it sometimes, right? But even though she had all this, she struggled. She tried really hard to keep her head above water, and she even had friends that were there to help her, with one of her friends even helping her get another job after she lost her job because she couldn't deal with it due to depression. A friend got her a job at a church nursery, but again, she only lasted a couple of months before depression got the best of her, and she just had to leave. She just sort of seemed to go through these waves where she would seem good, she would be on a high note, everything would seem fine, she would seem put together, she would seem like she had control, but then the wave would come down and she would be super low and just out of it, super unattentive and unresponsive, and obviously that didn't work well for a nursery job because you are watching other people's kids. You need to be on top of things, and she was said to just not pay attention in the way that you would want somebody caring for children to do. Oh, and on top of that, so she had this job, so she worked with one of her friends, right? Her friend got her the job, so she worked with one of her friends, but Leslie would not talk to her friend and would just leave at the end of the day without even saying bye, and this really hurt her friend's feelings. But when she would bring this up to Leslie and be like, hey, this hurt my feelings when you did this, she was like, oh, sorry I did that, I'm just dealing with something that I have to deal with by myself. And whatever she was dealing with just seemed to be getting worse because she had the depression, right? But she seemed to be getting a little more paranoid here and there, and even seemed to maybe be having hallucinations, because one of her friends said that Leslie, quote, went totally bonkers, believing that her house had been bugged. And if that wasn't bad enough, it even got to the point where she was barely communicating with anyone at all. She got very withdrawn. She isolated herself completely. And it was around this time that she first tried to take her own life and ended up being hospitalized. Leslie was hospitalized at the Psychiatric Institute of Washington, where they determined that she had been experiencing delusions. And she was put on antipsychotic medication, and that seemed to be working for a bit at least. And during that time, friends of the couple helped Tony care for Erin since he was still working. And they said that he didn't really ever talk about what was going on with Leslie. They were able to put two and two together because they were having to help him. But he was the type of person to just sort of pretend like nothing was wrong and go about his life as usual. Now, after about a month of being in the hospital after this attempt on her life, Leslie was released. And she was said to be doing better across the board. Her friends even noticed it. It was so funny. Not funny. Just, I was reading an article, and the friends were like, oh my god, she got new curtains. She lost weight. She's cured. It was very 80s housewives of them, in my opinion. But she did seem to be doing better. She was put on medication, and it did seem to be helping her. But even with, being on medication and doing better, this was still something she was dealing with pretty much by herself, right? People in her life were just kind of pretending that it wasn't happening instead of talking about it with her. Her friends, her family, her loved ones, they weren't really an outlet for her. She didn't have an outlet to be able to talk about what she was feeling. So she was like, yeah, I'm medicated, but I'm still going through all this stuff. And I'm just going through it by myself because everyone wants to pretend like nothing's going on. And it got to a point that at one point, okay, a friend of hers asked her how are you? How was it in the hospital? Brought it up. And Leslie was like, oh my God, thank you so much for asking that. I wish more people would ask that. I wish somebody would talk to me about this. Now, after a couple of years on this medication, the doctor that had prescribed Leslie the medication actually took her off of it. They decided that she didn't need it anymore. And it was after that that Leslie decided that she wasn't going to see a psychiatrist anymore either. She was just going to completely stop going to therapy, which was a choice that people didn't think was the best one. And people started to kind of gossip around the town about Tony not being more involved and not caring enough to try to keep her, going to therapy or insisting she was on medication kind of thing. There's a lot of gossip around the town saying that Tony wasn't the most supportive partner, that he was unwilling to see how sick his wife was, and that it was just something he chose to not let exist in his mind, which is not good, but also reasonable. It would be kind of hard to admit that your wife has such a serious problem, but we don't know what was really happening, right? Because there's people that say he, sucked, and then there was him who said, no, that's not true. I tried everything I could. I tried to talk to her. I tried to be there for her. I tried to get her to go back to the doctor. I tried to get her to take medication, but whenever I would talk to her about it, she would get mad, and she wouldn't budge, is what he would say. And to sort of illustrate his mindset around the whole situation, he did say of his wife and her mental illness at the time, and I quote, "I think her problem was life. I tried to help her. Life is not bad. There are ups and downs. Everyone copes and gets along." Now, I personally think that does say a lot. That statement alone does say a lot. But what do you think? Now, we'll never know what was really going on behind closed doors. But what we do know is that whether it be Tony's lack of understanding what she was going through or other, interpersonal marital issues that the two were dealing with, over time, Leslie started to, they started to drift apart, and Leslie started getting to a point where she was unhappy in the marriage. She wanted out of the marriage. She didn't want to be with Tony anymore because we can't say for sure that being in that relationship was making Leslie worse, but we do know that it wasn't making Leslie better. She said that she was changing and Tony couldn't accept it, and that she wanted a divorce and had even met with a divorce attorney, but she was scared that if she tried to separate from Tony, that she would lose Erin. That was her biggest fear in leaving the relationship. In a diary entry, she wrote of this, quote, "I would still like to get away, but I guess this is next to impossible. No money, no job or hope of ever working. There's a lot I can live without, and I think I would be willing to just hit the road if it didn't mean leaving Erin." A friend said that Tony was the type of guy who would take everything if Leslie was to try to leave him. So she was
ending the relationship in small increments, taking baby steps to drive a wedge between the two of them, like just, not being as loving, not being as cuddly, not going out with him like socially, which wasn't difficult because he really wasn't home that much anyway. He was the senior vice president of North Virginia Savings and Loan Institution, so he worked a lot and he really just was hardly ever home. Now, Tony has said that he didn't know anything about this, that Leslie never brought up the subject of divorce to him, and that this is totally out of the blue. But Leslie did herself say that she did bring it up and that he refused. So I don't know, he was just the type of guy that was like, oh, yeah, we had our problems. Of course we had our problems. But to my knowledge, they weren't marriage ending problems. So that's what was going on there. But, whether he knew and is saying that he didn't know or whether he really didn't know, we know there were some things that he didn't know or that we would hope he didn't know because of things that happened and steps that could have been taken to prevent it. But Leslie was getting worse. Her depression was worsening, and she at one point tried to run her car off the road to take her own life. She would talk with friends about how unattractive she thought she was and how unhappy she was. And she would make jokes about taking her own life. And inwardly, she was suffering from delusions. It was getting worse, and it was turning to delusions where she thought that the radio and the TV was sending her messages about the fact that they wanted to hurt her or hurt Erin. So it was just getting really bad on in her brain. Things were just swirly twirly gumdrops, and they weren't good gumdrops. You know what I'm saying? And Tony did say that he would try to protect his daughter from this. When she would get bad, he would try to make sure that she wouldn't be aware of what was going on. But it has been said that when Leslie would get particularly bad, on certain days when she was particularly bad, Erin would go and sit in the car by herself to just try to escape. So clearly she was seeing this go down with her mother. Now, there were other examples that people tried to use later to say that Erin knew what was going on with her mother and knew that she was getting worse. It was foreshadowing things to come. But they were basically connecting dots to form pictures that weren't really there. For example, in October of 1981, Erin wrote a short story called The Thing in the Woods, and it was kind of a horror story. I can never say that word, even though it's one of my favorite things in life, horror. But she wrote this story, and basically the story was about a young couple who buys a haunted house, and that everybody who had lived in the house prior to them had died, right? And in the story, the mom gets on a horse and runs off into the woods on this horse, and then the husband finds her dead. And supposedly it was kind of graphic too. I read a little bit of it. It was kind of a graphic story. She was a good writer. But in the story, the mom was said to very much resemble Leslie. The way it was written, the way it was described, it basically was Leslie. And she wrote this terrifying story. She knew something was going to happen, but the teacher came out and was like, listen, Erin was one of several children who wrote a short story for a Halloween assignment. That's why it's scary. That's why it's spooky. Let's stop trying to make a case that's already so fucking tragic, more tragic than it has to be. Anyways, as the months went on, Leslie seemed to get more and more depressed. She would stay in her home. She wasn't going out and socializing. She would pull her shades down and keep it dark in the house. When she would go out into her yard, she would just stand there and stare like she was in a trance. And on the few occasions she would talk to her friends, she asked several of them, do you think I'm okay? And people were just trying to come up with something in their minds to explain what was happening, to try to make it normal, to say she was just going through something, trying to find herself, a midlife crisis, something that everybody goes through, and hers is just more intense. But for Leslie, she was scared. She was scared that she was suffering from the same mental health issues that her father suffered from. It was during January and February of 1982 that her mood swings became more apparent. She would have periods of time where for a day or two she would be completely shut down. She would be in bed the entire time, and then she would have a couple days after that where she was super high energy, just go, trying to get everything done all at once because she was feeling like she could. And it was around this time that she actually threw a birthday party, slumber party for Erin, and the planning for it was when she was in a high phase, but the actual day of the party ended up being on one of her low days. So she was very off and very quiet and distant, not putting on the party. And it was so bad that it was noticeable to the kids, and one of the kids went home and told their mother.
This friend, this mother that was also a friend of Leslie's, was like, what do we do? I need to do something. We need to try to help her. But where is the line? Where is the line between friendship and intrusion? Like, her friends seemed like they wanted to do something, but they couldn't figure out what to do that wouldn't just upset her. They were worried that anything they do was just going to make her upset, heighten her anxiety, or make her depression worse. In the days leading up to the murder, though, she did seem off, but not more off than usual. One friend said that she had seen Leslie 2 days before the murder, and that Leslie's face just looked swollen and puffy and like she had been crying, and that Leslie just looked at her and was like, "Your hair's really pretty." And then another friend said that she saw her the night before the murders and that her and Leslie had gotten together to play bridge, and that she did seem quiet and subdued, but mostly she just seemed like really down, and that this friend wasn't worried about her, she just felt sorry for her. And her husband Tony said that he knew something was wrong. He knew this was a down period for her, but he didn't know how bad it was going to get. Like, he had no idea that it was going to get this bad. The morning of March 18th, 1982 was a totally normal day until it wasn't. Leslie and Tony were up, buzzing bees, busy bees, moving around, getting their day started. Tony was getting ready to leave for work, and Leslie was getting ready to pick up a bunch of kids to drive them to swimming practice because she was the one doing carpool that day. And normally, she was doing the carpool because Erin was one of the kids who would normally go to this, but on this day, Erin didn't go, and Leslie just told Tony that that Erin didn't want to go, which wasn't weird. He's like, okay, sure. So at about 6 a.m., Leslie left to go and drive the kids to the swimming practice. She picked them all up. She drove them all there, and the kids just said that Leslie seemed very quiet. And while Leslie was off driving these kids to swimming practice, Tony left for work. 38-year-old Leslie then came home, where she went to her room and went under her bed and pulled out a Remington 12-gauge semi-automatic shotgun that she had bought Tony for Christmas a previous year. Now, Tony says he knew that it was there, but to his knowledge, it wasn't loaded, and Leslie didn't even know how to use the gun, but it turns out he was incorrect because she took it out and she loaded it. Then sometime between 7 and 8 that morning, she walked into her daughter's room where she was sleeping. She was just laying there on her side, a little girl still in her nightgown. She took the shotgun. She put it up against the blanket, and she pulled the trigger, shooting her daughter through the right shoulder. She literally just walked in, put the gun against her back, closed her eyes, and fired at point-blank range. This caused massive internal lacerations and fractures. She had damages to her lungs, her trachea, her esophagus, and her ribs, and had massive internal bleeding, and with any luck, died instantly. She then left her daughter's room and went back to her own room, where she sat down and propped the gun on the floor with it aiming at her heart so that she could take her own life. But what she didn't account for was the length of the gun. It was longer than she thought it would be, and also the kickback. So when she shot herself, the gun jumped, and instead of hitting her in the heart, it actually shot her in the left shoulder area, almost amputating her arm, from her body, because it's a shotgun. And when it wasn't successful in killing her instantly, she just laid there and hoped that she would bleed to death. Meanwhile, her friend Mary is trying to get a hold of her, right? Her friend Mary started trying to call her at 2:30 p.m. So this was hours that had gone by, still laying there alive. But when she calls Mary, Mary doesn't answer, obviously, because she's hoping to die. So she keeps calling and she keeps getting a busy signal. So her, Mary, and 2 other friends who were supposed to meet up with Leslie that day to go play tennis are like, okay, that's weird, let's drive over. They go over, they knock on the door, they get no response, and all the doors are locked, and she's still not answering the phone. So they're like, okay, let's go play tennis. Maybe she'll show up there. And when they got to the tennis place, the tennis courts, they actually tried to call her from there as well, but still got no answer. Once they were done playing tennis, they went back to Leslie's home, and they got there at about 6:15 p.m. And again, there was no sign of anybody being in the house. They knocked on the door, and they didn't hear anything inside but the couple's dog, Daisy. So they're like, this is weird. So they go, they get that neighbor to get them a key, and they let themselves inside. And once they let themselves inside, that's when they find that Leslie is upstairs suffering from a gunshot wound, a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and she's telling them that she killed her daughter. And I can only imagine what walking into the scene would be like, because if you think about it, this is 6:15 p.m. She shot herself and her daughter, Erin, between 7 and 8 in the morning. So she's been laying there all of these hours just bleeding out. I can only, that would be a horrifying sight to walk into. But despite the horrible scene, Leslie was alive. She was conscious. She was like verbal. She tells their friends, like, listen, I shot my daughter. And so they panic. They freak out. They call the cops, and Leslie's just laying there and eventually asks her friend for a cigarette. She's very casual through this whole situation. Even when the officers arrived, one of the first things that she said to the officers when they arrived was, just let me die. So the police came, the media came, neighbors flooded out into the street just to try to get a sight of what was going on, try to figure out what's going on, and all the gossip and rumors are swirling. But Tony is nowhere to be found because apparently Tony, like Leslie, had a scheduled tennis match, a tennis. So he wasn't home when all of this happened. For hours he was gone. He actually showed up at 10:30 p.m. from tennis, 10:30 p.m. from tennis, and he gets there to this scene, right? The police, the media, everybody outside. So he runs to the door, like asking what's going on, and then we know what he learned. Now, this murder was a huge deal. Like, the neighborhood was completely shattered. And I feel like if any mother in any neighborhood shot and killed their own child, that would be like earth-shattering for a lot of people. But it was particularly intense for everyone because it was Leslie, because of her prominence in the neighborhood, because of her reputation of being such a wonderful mother. Again, everyone said she was great. They couldn't believe that she could be the one to do this. And one neighbor even said of this, and I quote, she had money, a nice house. She was good looking, fun to be with, had a world of friends. ... And on top of that, on top of the fact that so many people knew her to be so wonderful, so many people also knew that she was struggling, right? It wasn't a secret. So many people were blaming themselves. Many people were blaming other people around the neighborhood. They all seemed to know that she needed help, but didn't understand why she didn't get it. Then you add the fact that the neighborhood kids are freaking out. They know what happened. They're old enough to understand that this girl's mom, the person who's supposed to keep you so safe, killed her. So they're freaking out. And I guess like the kids and the parents and teachers all met at the school the day after Erin was killed so that they could talk to each other and they could talk to the kids and explain what was going on. And apparently one teacher even took some kids aside. I thought this was so weird. One teacher, did I say one parent? One teacher took some kids aside who had parents who were like in therapy and told them, like, listen, I just want you to understand that just because your parents are in therapy, like Leslie was in therapy, that doesn't mean that they're going to kill you. And when I read that, I was like, that seems like you're crossing some sort of line, but okay. Now, speaking of the kids, as far as the kids went, they were all dealing in different ways because, you know, they're all different little people. Some of them planted a cherry tree in Erin's honor on the school grounds and held a bake sale in her honor and raised about $100. But despite their trying to do something positive for their friend, many of the kids were suffering. Some weren't sleeping, some were clinging to their moms. And what's really sad is some were avoiding their moms because they were like, are you gonna do that to me too? One neighbor, a mother, said of this situation that, like, Leslie doing this destroyed something in these kids and in this community because the mother is the one person that's supposed to be the safest for their kids. So Leslie, prior to being arrested, was actually taken to Washington Hospital Center because she needed treatment because her arm was all types of fucked up. And she actually ended up having to have most of her left arm amputated because it was just too, like, again, all types, FUBAR City on this arm situation. So that's taken care of. And while she was in the hospital, her demeanor was kind of odd. It seemed like she was disconnected from what had happened. Like, I don't know, I just feel like you would feel so much and care so much that you wouldn't want to see people. But Leslie was actually able to have visitors from family and friends at the hospital, which I also thought, like the brother from 50 First Dates. That's what I was trying to say. Anyway, she was actually able to have friends and family visit her in the hospital, which is something that I wouldn't think would be allowed to happen when the person is going to be arrested for murder, but she was. And one of her friends said that once Leslie saw her and was talking to her about what happened, Leslie said to her friend, quote, "Here I go, dumping my shit on you again." It was when Leslie's family, her mother and her sister, arrived that the reality of what was happening seemed to sink in for her, because that's when she really broke down. She cried and she cried, and I guess she said to her mother, quote, I loved her, Why didn't God want me? On August 5th, 1982, 3 months after the murder, Leslie DeVeau finally appeared in court where she was being charged with the first-degree murder of her 10-year-old daughter, Erin Knight DeVeau. Now, Leslie and her attorneys pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Her attorney saying that they weren't going to try to say that Leslie didn't do this, because, like, how could, they do that? It was very clearly Leslie. We all heard about the scene, right? It was clear. But they were going to try to prove that she wasn't legally responsible for her actions due to her mental health issues. Several of Leslie's friends and family members were present for the hearings, and Leslie seemed to be in an overall good mood during her trial, which is crazy to think about. But she was, like, talkative. She interacted with them. The only time, well, not the only time, when things seemed to shift is when they started talking about Leslie's mental health history. When that happened, her mood visibly changed and she started to cry. Obviously, after everything we've talked about through this video, Leslie's mental health is going to be a subject at trial. Even before I told you that it was going to be that she was pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, I feel like it was pretty clear we were heading in that direction. So after she was arrested, she saw many doctors. She saw, all the doctors, as I'm sure you can imagine. And these doctors testified at her trial and, like, talked about her mental health history. The court was informed about Leslie's month-long stay at the hospital in the fall of 1979 and was told that she was kept on medication until the spring of 1981. They were told that her condition worsened after she stopped taking her medication, and as time went on with Leslie unmedicated, she was, quote, unable to distinguish fantasy from reality and suffered delusions that people were following her. They also noted that Leslie, was preoccupied with getting out of her marriage. Her marriage was causing her distress and, making things worse for her. But Tony was not willing to separate. This is what they said in court, that Tony was not willing to separate, and this contributed to her declining mental health. They talked about how all these compounding issues led her to try to take her own life 2 months before the murder. And then just a month before the murder, Leslie wrote in her diary of a, quote, fantasy island, a place where she and her daughter could go and be safe from all the ills, end quote, that she saw around them. And she believed that after her and her daughter died, they could go to this, like, fantasy island. She truly seemed to think, this is what doctors said, that she truly seemed to think that nothing but badness awaited her and her daughter, and that she, Leslie, was protecting Erin from the worst, and that if she just took her own life, which is something that she wanted to do, she would have left Erin alive but unprotected. The defense also presented some information that I think was very telling and very sad. They said that Tony wanted to have more children, but that Leslie was unable to have them. Again, she had all of those miscarriages, and they really weighed on her. They said that Leslie felt that she couldn't give her husband what he wanted, and that was very difficult for her, especially because she was, in a time where that was kind of, the wife's duty to give your husband what you want. I'm sorry, I rolled my eyes. That's not the life that I live, right? And that since she felt like she couldn't do anything for him, that he wanted this weight on her and contributed to what she did. And also they believe part of why she did what she did when she did is because one of her close friends was due to give birth to a baby on the same day that Leslie killed Erin. The defense also had another theory that is just incredibly dark. And I can't say that this is true, right? I wasn't there, but they said this, so I'm going to tell you this. They said that they believed it was possible that Tony, knowing of Leslie's prior suicide attempts, had hidden the gun or stored the gun under the bed with the ammo with it to sort of make it possible for Leslie to succeed at the missions that she previously put out. Which is so dark, and it is worth mentioning that he 100% denies that. He has come out and said, like, listen, I couldn't protect her from every single way that she could take her own life. If she really was determined to do so, even if I moved the gun, she could find another way to do what she wanted to do. He said that if he knew how bad she truly was, he would have moved the gun, but he really didn't think she was that bad because she had been bad before and she had never done anything quite like this. And who knows, maybe he just wasn't paying that close attention to see how bad she was. But either way, the couple didn't really see each other much after Leslie murdered Erin. I think they just saw each other a couple of times in divorce court. The two divorced in 1984. And it was very tense. There was a report that said at one of the hearings, he couldn't take it, and he yelled at her, and he was like, "You murdered my child." And then she yelled back like, "You had a part in it." And I don't even think, if I remember correctly, he went to any of Leslie's murder trial. So they were pretty much, this was the straw that broke the camel's back for that relationship, which I get it. He has said that he was shattered by his daughter's death, and that he was just taking it one day at a time with friends like to lean on and for support instead of like going to therapy. He seemed like he was kind of anti-therapy in some of the stuff I read. So he wasn't doing that. He said he had his friends to lean on that was better than a therapist, but he said that it was so bad that he couldn't even bring himself to go into his daughter's room. He also added that he didn't want to know the details. I think that's part of why he didn't go to the murder trial. He didn't want to know the details of what happened to his child, but he has said that he has some ideas as to why Leslie did what she did, but he didn't say what those ideas were. Now, the prosecution, they were like, even if you have mental health issues, I don't believe that's why you did what you did. And several times throughout the trial, they called her a, quote, psychotic killer. And this seemed to really upset Leslie. Whenever they would call her that, she would get pretty hysterical. And it got to the point that like her own attorney couldn't even communicate with her. Now, despite the fact that the prosecution was trying to build their case around the fact that Leslie wasn't crazy, she was a killer, their own expert witness ended up being the cause of their case kind of falling through. So this was a guy, a psychiatrist, 31-year-old Neil Bloomberg, and his job was to meet with Leslie, meet with those who knew Leslie, and determine, 1, if she was mentally ill, or 2, if the mental illness did exist, did it cause her to lack the substantial capacity to, quote, appreciate the wrongfulness of what she has done or to behave accordingly to the law. So, after meeting with Leslie on 3 different occasions and talking to basically everyone who knew her, Bloomberg came to the decision that, or the determination, that Leslie was severely mentally ill, deeply psychotic, and not responsible for the murder of her daughter. And remember, this is the prosecution's expert witness. Bloomberg believes that Leslie saw herself as a bad person who brought harm to anyone that she loved, and that she truly believed that by killing herself and killing her daughter, they'd be better off. She truly believed that they'd be better off dead. He said specifically of this, and I quote, "The act of murder, as bizarre as it seems, I think for her was an act of love. Something terrible was going to happen in the world, and the only way to protect her and Erin was for them to leave together." And this was something that everyone who knew her agreed with. Even Tony, who we know was not like super stoked on her after the fact. They all praised her as a mother and said that she and Erin had like an ideal type of relationship. And Leslie's own mother said that she truly believes the only reason that Leslie killed Erin was so that the two of them could be together. She said of this, and I quote, "It was an act of love. Believe me. The truth is they both loved the child very, very much, and the stress was too much. It's just a stressful world. She couldn't bear to leave her." Okay, so now, you know how usually when somebody is arrested, the prosecution has the burden of proof. Like, they need to prove that this person did it in order to get a conviction. Well, apparently when somebody, I don't know if this is everywhere, but here, when somebody claims that they are mentally ill, the defense then has the burden of proof to prove that the person's mental illness or defect made it so that they didn't know right or wrong or couldn't conform with, like, the law. So the defense presents their case. They're showing the case. This is why she is crazy. This is the proof that she is crazy and not responsible. And then the defense has to sort of try to counter that. So the defense tries. The defense tries to, like, poke holes. No, excuse me. The prosecution tries to poke holes in the defense's, presentation of Leslie being mentally ill. And they were unable to. They couldn't contest the defense's defense of insanity because their own psychiatrist agreed and believed that it was true. So with that, in December of 1982, Leslie was she was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, I believe it's called, St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and she was there for a minimum term of 50 days, which sounds like crazy, 50 days, but basically what happens is you go for the minimum term, so she'd go for 50 days, and at the end of 50 days, they would determine if her mental illness was still there, like if she was cured, right? And if she was, she could get out after 50 days. But if she wasn't, she would have to stay for a minimum of 6 months after that. And then each 6 months there would be a review to see if she was at a point where she could be released. So anyways, after 50 days, Leslie was brought back before the court to determine whether or not she was mentally sound. And spoiler alert, she was not, which makes sense because 50 days does not seem like enough time to get somebody who could do something like this back to a place where they were like healthy. You know what I mean? It doesn't seem like enough, but I'm not a doctor. Not a doctor. So she was then, you know, sentenced to do 6 months at minimum so that they could determine if she was any better. Because at this point, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia and she was receiving treatment. She was giving medication and therapy, all of that. So she was kept longer, is what I'm trying to say. Poorly. So she was medicated in the hospital. They were giving her an antipsychotic and an antidepressant, and they worked very well when she was taking them. But at one point during her hospital stay, she actually started to stockpile her medication, and she took them all in another attempt to take her life, but it was unsuccessful. And she actually didn't tell the doctors about this. She didn't talk about the fact that she did this until after, spoiler alert, she was released. I guess it's not a spoiler alert if you guys watched my John Hinckley video, but for anyone who skipped that one because you're like, I know all there is to know about John Hinckley. 1, I don't think you do, maybe watch the video. 2, I talked about this in that video too. In the hospital, she was just really having trouble coming to terms with what she did. She said that some mornings she would wake up and forget what had happened. So she would wake up expecting her child to be there and then realizing she wasn't and then realizing why she wasn't, which sounds incredibly traumatizing. She says that while she was in the hospital, she would just take time praying for forgiveness to her daughter. And she said specifically of this quote, "It takes a long time to really realize that what happened was a delusion. As you're coming out of that, you realize that it was all awful because there's nothing and you're alive. And you don't want to be and you're not supposed to be." And that had to be incredibly hard to deal with. I can't imagine being in that position. I don't struggle from that type of mental illness, thankfully. I'm not going to get into anything that I've dealt with personally because anything you say about your life can be weaponized against you on the internet. That's just the truth. That's one of my protocols when it comes to being on the internet, is not sharing anything that I don't want to be attacked, right? But it had to be hard for Leslie to have that sort of intense delusion, to do something as terrible as killing your child for it. And then there's conflicting statements on what type of hospital St. Elizabeth's was, but I do know that one nurse against protocol did call Leslie a child murderer to her face. So that had to be a difficult environment to try to get well in, at least in some ways. Now, Leslie did apply for conditional release in October of 1983. Apparently, the doctors at the hospital and even the prosecutor's psychiatrist, Bloomberg, did recommend that she do be released. They said that she should be able to leave the hospital grounds on the weekends and be released into the custody of her sister so that she could start, you know, dealing with the stressors of the outside world, to see if she could deal with the stressors of the outside world. And I guess she was even going to have like a part-time job working at a church as like a pastor's assistant, I believe. And they said of her, quote, "She had recovered sufficiently and she would not be a danger to herself or others if she was released under the proposed conditions." They added that her mental illness was in a substantial degree of remission and that this would be vital to knowing if she could handle the stresses of re-entering normal life, considering the horror of what she had done. The prosecution was against this, obviously, saying that Leslie's case is a perfect example of why psychiatrists should not try to predict the future, because Leslie had been in a hospital and was deemed to be not a danger and was released, and then this happened. So the judge heard all of this information from both sides and decided that they could not confidently determine that Leslie's mental illness had been cured to a point that they felt safe with her being released, so they denied her application for release. Now, Leslie did appeal this, saying that though the court had come to the conclusion that they didn't believe that she had, quote, regained her mental health, the doctors, the people whose job it is to make this determination, did believe that giving her conditional release would be a, quote, therapeutic measure. The appeal was denied, though, with the higher court agreeing that, you know, they didn't feel confident that she wouldn't be a danger to herself or others because she had previously been in a hospital, had been deemed to be safe for release, then went on to murder her daughter and try to kill herself. So it took some time, but Leslie was given sporadic freedoms here and there. You know, it takes time. We've seen this before. There's a couple of years. I won't say it was a lot of time with Leslie, if I'm honest. I've seen a lot more time. I mean, even in John Hinckley, he was in He was in the hospital a lot longer than Leslie, but by mid-1985, so a few short years later, Leslie's doctors did petition the court saying that they believed that she should be moved to full-time outpatient services because she had dramatically improved. Her symptoms were it was night and day. She was so much better. And she was actually granted this release. During this time, she was still under, the hospital's jurisdiction, but she was able to get a part-time job. She was able to go and take classes at George Washington University. She was even able to live in her own apartment. This was the first time that she had ever lived on her own. And she took a photo of her daughter and she hung it above her desk. Her daughter, who, if I did my math correctly, would be a teenager now. She also kept a box of her daughter's possessions, and in this box was actually, oh God, my heart, it was Erin's blanket that she called her night-night. And Leslie said that when she opened the box, it somehow still smelled like her daughter. So she slept with that blanket for a long time until that smell was eventually gone. By April of 1990, Leslie petitioned the court to be declared legally sane. And if this was to happen, that means that Leslie would be completely released from all hospital supervision. She would just be like any normal person walking around with no past. And the hospital actually agreed with this motion. They thought that she was at a place where this could happen. Even the prosecutor's psychiatrist, we keep bringing him up, but Bloomberg, he too said he believed that she was deemed to be sane and should be legally declared sane. And he said of this, quote, "I've seen a lot of people who have gone through the system and been found not responsible, and I've never seen a course of treatment that has gone as well as Ms. DeVeau's." He then added if he was to interview her now with no knowledge of her past, he would just declare her as a normal person, legally sane, no mental illness. If he didn't know she had done something, he would never know that she had done something. When Leslie testified during this hearing, her own attorney asked her about her daughter, Erin. Erin, who would be 18 years old by the time this hearing took place. And Leslie said of her daughter, and I quote, "I think right after the shooting, it hurt so bad, I couldn't even stand to think. It has been terrible to find peace with knowing that I killed the child I loved more than anything in the world." And at the end of this hearing, the judge did release Leslie from all supervision. She was totally free. Now, I did mention that Leslie DeVeau and John Hinckley Jr. got into a relationship when they were in the hospital together, and it lasted a very long time. Now, I don't want to get into all the history of that relationship because I covered it pretty extensively in my John Hinckley video, so you should watch that, or you probably already know, because I feel like most people who watch my videos watch all of them, I think, right? Comment down below if you watch every video. You're a real one. But what I will say is that Leslie said the reason the relationship started in the first place is that she needed somebody to mother because she was a little bit older than John Hinckley. I think 10 years. I forget now. It's been a few weeks between filming of videos because life happened. Let me tell you, having a baby, life does happen. So she needed somebody to mother. She said that her arms ached, which something about that, oh God, it makes me want to cry. Something about that just makes me hurt. And she said that she needed somebody to love her and to know that she could be loved despite all of her ugliness. She also added that many people would believe that what she did was worse than what John Hinckley did, that she could never just go out there and be another person. She couldn't move to the suburbs and get married because of what she had done and who she was. So she keeps people at arm's length because she doesn't feel like she has the emotional capacity to deal with other people and what they will feel about her because most people can't understand her. But she says with John, the reason this relationship was so successful is that he gets her in a way that almost nobody else ever could. The relationship, I will say though, is over now. They were together a really long time, but Leslie got to a point where she couldn't live her life in the way she wanted to, being John Hinckley Jr.'s girlfriend. She couldn't live under the radar. She just wants a quiet life. And with being with John, that wasn't possible. The Secret Service was all up in her shit while they were together. They would go through her financial records, her trash. If she traveled, they were on it. She couldn't have the quiet life she wanted. So she did end the relationship, but the two are friends as far as I know and still support each other because they both see the other as a vital piece of their recovery. Both of them see the other as that. So if you haven't seen that video, I would suggest watching it. It's one of my longest I've ever done, and it's one that I'm actually really proud of, the research I did into it. I feel like it's one of my better videos. Not in the filming, my lord, not in the filming, but hopefully that doesn't discourage you. I'm just practicing with a new setup, and that was the first one. I don't really like how it looks, but the video, the information itself, I think is great. And the whole reason I bring this up actually is because after Leslie's release, she did an interview. And this is one of the only interviews she did. And I believe it was in 1999. The only reason she even did this interview was for John. She said that John wasn't being treated fairly by the legal system or the medical system, and that she wanted to do this interview to be his voice since he couldn't speak. And she wanted people to see who John really was since the media wasn't showing that. And so that was what the point of this interview was for. But in reading this interview, because it was a long one, the article is pretty long, you learned a lot about Leslie, her backstory, and her case as well. I got to learn about Leslie herself, about how she felt during that time, what she thought during that time, and how she felt about her daughter. And Leslie said of her daughter during this interview, and I quote, "I adored her. I cannot tell you how much she meant to me. And you know what a child's like. It's as if you can't believe this gift that's been given to you. It was my way of keeping her safe. I can remember holding on to the thought for a long time that God had wanted me to do this. So somehow it was all going to turn out all right." And one thing about this interview, in particular this article, that really stuck out to me and made me wonder is the interviewer kept wondering to themselves, how does Leslie live with herself? How do you live with yourself and go on with life knowing you did what you did to the person you say that you love so much? And one day the interviewer did ask Leslie this, because I guess they met several times in writing this article. And the interviewer asked Leslie, how do you live with yourself? And Leslie responded with, quote, "Many times over the years I have gotten angry. Why did I get well?" And something this interviewer wrote in this article that really, really stuck with me, and something that I want to end this video with, is the fact that they said that, yes, Leslie was in the hospital for what she did, and that must have been incredibly difficult, but that sanity was Leslie's true punishment.
And now with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the murders of 17-year-old Natalie Henderson and 17-year-old Carter Davis. So our case today begins on the warm summer morning of August 1st, 2016, and this is in the area of the North Fulton County in Roswell, Georgia. It's just before 6 a.m. when a delivery driver is making their normal delivery that they always do, and this is to a grocery store, and the grocery store is called Publix, and this Publix was on Woodstock Road. Now, it should have been a totally normal morning. This is something, if you've ever been to a store early in the morning, you see these big trucks dropping off bread and things like that. But this was anything but, because when this driver got to the store to start unloading what they had to unload, they saw that there were two bodies in the wooded area behind this Publix grocery store. Police were, of course, called, and reportedly, due to the commotion of these two bodies being found behind this store, a lot of locals came out. There were a lot of people at the scene when police got there. So when police did get there, they were actually met with some anxious parents whose kids were missing. They said as far as they knew, when they had went to bed that night, their kids were in their homes sleeping in their beds, and that when they woke up in the morning, they were not there. And these kids were 17-year-old Natalie Henderson and her friend 17-year-old Carter Davis, who were supposedly very good kids, very just normal, average teenagers, and put to their families anything but normal or average. They were exceptional. They weren't the type of kids who had any problem with anyone, so there's no reason why this should have happened to them. Now, let's talk about who these kids were, what happened to them, and then the aftermath of trial and all of that. So let's start with Natalie Henderson. She was born on December 15th, 1998, which sounds far too young for a person born in 1998 to no longer be with us anymore, but that is the reality of the situation. And she was one of two daughters that were born to Suzanne and Matthew Henderson. She was said to have been a very typical teenage girl filled with energy. She was the type of girl that her friend Shell said could walk into any room and brighten up anyone's day. She was said to be, quote, whip smart, funny, sassy, and strong, end quote, a true sweet Southern belle who literally did not have a problem with anyone. Her friends say they loved the way she would giggle and give warm hugs, and she was just the type of person who brightened up the day of any person that she came across. In addition to being very smart, because she was on the honor roll at Roswell High School, which was actually right across the street from the shopping center where the Publix was, where she would later be found killed. She was also very talented. She could sing, she could play guitar, and I actually saw a video of her in one of the news reports that I read, like online, that showed her singing and playing the guitar, and she was clearly very talented. She had a very pretty voice. She was also a lifeguard for Swim Atlanta and a leader in the school's color guard, which was apparently very important to her. One of her good friends said that she lived and breathed color guard. She was this little cute, like fun-sized girl who was passionate and beautiful and sassy and strong, but also soft. You know, she loved animals and volunteered at a rescue organization. And she loved them so much that after she was killed, her family asked that instead of flowers, people make a donation to Companion Animal Connection and Waleska. Waleska? Waleska. Waleska. She was the type of person who was unapologetically herself, which was very unusual and rare for somebody as young as she was. And she was said to just have a, quote, infectious zest for life, which may be what attracted her or what made her attractive to 17-year-old Carter Davis. So Carter was a bit of the new kid in school, at least compared to Natalie. He was actually from South Dakota, from Rapid City, South Dakota specifically, but his family had moved to Georgia, and at the time that he was killed, he was about to start his senior year at the nearby River Ridge High School. Yeah, River Ridge High School. He was born on July 29th, 1999, to parents Jeremy and Michelle Davis, and based on his obituary, it seems like he may have actually been their only child, which is just so incredibly sad. I just truly can't imagine what that would be like. And he just seemed like such a good kid. They both seemed like such good kids. He was said to be a kid who made his family proud and really just lived his life to the fullest. He was said to be both a really good student who was always willing to help his classmates, with the River Ridge High School's principal releasing a statement after his murder where he said in part, quote, Carter was an energetic student who was known as a friend to all. He always came to class in a good mood and with a smile on his face. And he was also, this is the end of the quote, he was also said, in addition to being that, to being just like an excellent athlete. He played lots of sports like soccer, football, and lacrosse in both South Dakota and Georgia. And he was said to be like the star athlete. And he was even called by a lot of his teammates Coach Carter, because he was such like a person to look up to in the team, like the person that people would go to for help and things like that. And his loss devastated his teammates. I guess his old teammates in South Dakota, who called him Georgia, by the way, that was his nickname because he was the guy who moved to Georgia. After he was killed, they actually wore stickers of his number, like I guess helmet stickers is a thing. And so they wore stickers with his jersey number on their helmets in his honor. It's just heartbreaking, man. These kids were so young and they seemed to be so loved and happy and talented and fun-loving, and now they were just gone. And it seemed that every person who knew them was having trouble dealing with that. And at this age too, at the age of 17, to have this happen, there are so many kids who are also affected, right? Because this is the time when you just have like a million friends, and this is also the formative years where you're just figuring things out. And this was very difficult for them to learn and to deal with and find that they are not as invincible as they thought they were. Both of these kids, both Natalie and Carter, were going to be seniors. They were about to finish school and start their lives, and now they were just gone. And these kids who were going to be coming back to school with them, like school was about to start. Everybody was about to come, and just everything seemed so new. And now they were coming on the first day of school and finding out that this had happened. It was just very difficult. They even had grief counselors on site at both high schools to help kids and staff cope with kids learning in this moment that like the world really is tough and it's not fair. There were vigils held in the honor of both kids with hundreds of people coming out who, like hugged each other and lit candles and remembered the lives of the two that were taken just way too soon. One of Natalie's closest friends, her name was Emma, she spoke at the vigil and she just said that in learning what happened to her friend, it just completely devastated. It broke her heart. She felt like half of her had been ripped away because she saw Natalie as like a sister. And she said she just could not understand how anyone could want to do this to Natalie or to Carter. She said she hadn't met Carter, but Natalie had told her all about him, and he just sounded like such a good guy. And then there were the funerals. And as I'm sure you can imagine, funerals for 17-year-olds funerals in general are very sad things, but funerals for 17-year-old children are particularly heartbreaking. Natalie's funeral was at Roswell Presbyterian Church, and everyone was in tears. Several hundred people were there, and they were just in serious mourning because this is the type of thing that should not happen. Her obituary said that she was a free spirit with a gorgeous smile who could make your day or make your week. And Carter's funeral was at St. Martin's Episcopal Church, where his mother was actually a teacher. She taught 8th grade English, and 100 people were present, and many of his teammates who were there wore their jerseys in his honor. The headmaster of the school read a statement from Carter's family that said in part, quote, "His smile was a warm hug. Carter made friends easily and touched so many of us. Although his life was cut short, everyone in his life will remember how he loved the Lord and told them often he lived life to the fullest. And now he was gone. They were both gone, and police had to figure out what the hell happened here." So police had arrived at the scene, and they were very quickly able to put together that the two bodies that were found in the wooded area behind Publix were that of Natalie and Carter. And this scene was very jarring. It was very fucked up. There's honestly no other way to put it. It turns out that both of these kids' bodies were repositioned after they were killed. So Natalie was found totally nude in a suggestive position. She was laid with her legs completely spread, and she had a feather put into her hair. She also had a possible mark, like a burn mark on her big toe, which I've never seen explained. And as far as Carter, he was just wearing a pair of shorts, like underwear, I believe, and his arms were stretched out to pose him like a cross. And he too had a burn mark, but his was on his left big toe. And both of them had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. So that's a pretty graphic scene to walk into. That's a graphic scene for anybody to walk into. But apparently in this area, double homicides were particularly rare. And this city was seen as one of the safest cities in the state. So it was quite a lot for this local police department to tackle. But that's not to say that they didn't do the job, because they did the job and they did it very quickly. Because immediately they started going into overdrive. They were scrambling to see who did this. Was it somebody they knew? Was it like a stranger? And it seemed like it had to be somebody that they did not know, because nobody they knew that they were going to be sneaking out of their houses and meeting up together at this Publix in the first place. So it seemed like it had to be random. But it also seemed like it would be very hard to believe this was random because of how intense it was. Now, fortunately, in this case, it didn't take police long to at least have somewhere to start. And where they were going to start was with a car. So the car that they were looking for was a Honda Passport, which is like an SUV, a silver version of this car. That's like a weird way to say that. A silver Honda Passport was seen in the area of the murders around the time that police believed that the two kids had been killed. And this vehicle was distinct in a couple different ways. Notably, the vehicle that they had seen, because they saw this on surveillance, by the way, the vehicle that they were looking for had some visible damage to the area of the, quote, rear passenger side quarter panel, end quote. And there was a difference in coloring between the front and the rear wheels, with the rear wheels being darker. So this is two things that could help them narrow down from all the silver SUV Honda Passports out there and the one they were looking for, because there's not a large chance there's going to be two that fit that description. Right. So police released photos of this SUV and to the media, and said that they wanted anyone with any information on this SUV to come forward and give them said information. But in the meantime, police sat there and sorted through data on hundreds of vehicles who fit that description. Sure. Across 2 counties. So they were very busy. Now, the car, that was great. That was a great lead. That was a great place to start. But they did have more to that, because whoever had killed Natalie and Carter had also taken some things from them after they were killed. And one of the things was very important, and this was Natalie's card. It was called a debit card and a credit card in reportings, but I'm going to assume it was a debit card because she was only 17, but that is just an assumption. So apparently the person who had done this had also taken her debit card, had actually gone to her car and like reached in and got it out of her pocket, which is, I don't know why that note gets to me, but it does. So that was taken. And there were also jumper cables taken from Carter's car, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later. It doesn't matter quite as much. What did matter was Natalie's card, because again, Natalie's card had been stolen, and 90 minutes, just 90 minutes after the time that police believed they were killed, which was 3 a.m. They believed they were killed at 3 a.m. with the lead investigator on the case saying that nothing good ever happens at 3 a.m. Natalie's card was used at the Flash Foods gas station on Highway 92 in Woodstock. This was, again, just 90 minutes after they were believed to have been killed. So it wasn't Natalie using this card. Now, police got this lead super quickly because Natalie's family had been like monitoring her account, had seen the transaction, and had went to police and told them. So immediately they headed over to this gas station to see if they could find anything or to see if they could get their surveillance footage, which they did, to, investigate as investigators do. And when they looked at the surveillance footage for this gas station, what do you think they saw? The same SUV that they had seen at the murder scene was now at this gas station. So they were seeing that 1 + 1 really did equal 2. And even though they didn't have the license plate of the SUV, they were able to confirm that it was the same one based on the damage on the car. Yeah. And also the discoloring of the wheels, right? But they also got more information from this, which they actually did see this in the initial surveillance footage. But what they saw was a man. It was a young, well, they couldn't tell that he was young at the time. He was young, spoiler alert. Young man, shirtless, long hair, scraggly, wearing a mask, pacing around before pumping gas into the SUV and leaving. Leaving. My voice gave out there a little bit. I am endlessly sick. I've told you guys I'm sick. Apparently having a toddler means you're never going to be healthy again. So this is my voice now. I am so sorry. Now let's talk about this mask, because he's wearing a mask in the surveillance footage. Now, have you seen V for Vendetta? Yes, you, specifically you. Have you seen V for Vendetta? Well, if you haven't, one, you should. Remember, the 4th of November, which is incidentally my birthday. But in the movie, the main dude, he wears a mask. It's a Guy Fawkes mask, and he wears it throughout the movie. If you haven't seen it, I will put a photo. Okay. But this is the mask that this guy was wearing while he's pumping this gas, being erratic at the gas station. And he was also seen on surveillance around the Publix at the time of the murder wearing this mask as well, which is terrifying. Not that the mask itself is inherently scary, but to picture what these kids went through and then to think about the person who did it was wearing this mask at the time. For me, that's like a lot. And something about that makes it more scary to me. Anyways, moving on. Police were policing, doing police work like police do. And it didn't take them long to actually discover who this SUV was registered to. They were able to put that together like super, super quick. And it turned out this was a guy named Walter Hazelwood, which sounds very promising, and it is, but that's not to say that Walter was a suspect, because he wasn't. He didn't fit the description at all. He was a much older gentleman. It was not him. But they were like, because Walter had called the police and he had reported I think this was like 12 hours after the murders, he reported that one of his guns was stolen. Okay. And Walter had a grandson, and this was a 20-year-old man named Jeffrey Hazelwood. And Jeff, if you will, did fit the description of the person they had seen on surveillance. So they're looking into Jeff, and they're wondering if maybe there's a connection between Jeff and Natalie or Carter, because he is only 20, right? He's older than them, but he's not that much older than them. So they're like, maybe they did know each other. Maybe this was more of a personal situation. But when they're looking into it, they don't find any connection at all. Throughout this entire case, the biggest connection they were able to find is that Jeff may have known somebody that Carter knew. But Jeff didn't seem to know Natalie and didn't seem to know Carter, and none of their friends recognized him. But that didn't mean he wasn't somebody they wanted to look into, because obviously he was somebody they very much wanted to look into. So they put him and they put his car under surveillance. And in the meantime, they looked into him. They wanted to look at his cell phone records, which is where, I don't know if it's exactly where they started, but it's one of the first things they did, is they wanted to see if they could prove that his cell phone had been near the murder scene, or, the gas station where Natalie's card was used around the same times that they were being murdered and Natalie's card was being used. And Shyamalan twist, It was him. I was going to say it wasn't him. It was absolutely him. They were able to see that his phone was both at the murder site and also where Natalie's card was being used, presumably by her killer at that same time. So they're feeling pretty confident that Jeff is their guy. But of course, you have to prove it. So they start looking into him and they start to see that he is a dark guy. And they first notice this with his social media, or at least one of the ways they notice this is with his social media, because they get a lot more than just this. I'll tell you that. There's a lot to discuss about Jeff. But they do look at his social media and they see some of his posts are along the darker side. Like, for example, he had posted a photo on Instagram. I believe it was just one of those, like, it wasn't a photo of him. It was just one of those text photos that said, quote, "Eventually, the most kind-hearted person will grow cold. That's when you know they've been pushed too far." He also had photos of memes that read, "Love me or kill me," and "Your third face you never show anyone is the truest reflection of who you are." Then in one photo he posted of himself, he added the caption, quote, "Why the fuck should I live? Can't do shit right. All I do is hurt everybody, even the one I love more than my own life, and I swore to never hurt. I'm beyond fucked up. There's no one left." And below this photo, there was a comment from somebody. So somebody who was out there who at least cared about him, who responded to his photo and his like post about, sucking at life, saying, quote, "You always have me, Jeff, no matter what." And I do wonder who this was because the profile was like blocked off and that comment actually isn't there anymore. So I suspect this was his girlfriend, because he did have a girlfriend who we will get into a bit more later because she does come up a little bit, but the point is I'm not going to talk about her too much. I'm not going to get into her name because I'm sure she would like to separate herself from this a little bit. But the point is he did have a girlfriend at this time. And I think it was literally the day after Natalie and Carter were killed. She had gone into his work. He worked at Michael's. They both worked at Michael's, but separate locations. But she had gone into Michael's to visit him at work, and he had taken a photo of her and posted it on his Instagram saying, quote, "Getting things at Michael's for the wonderful art she makes. I love you." And this was literally posted the day after the double murders that they believed that he had committed. And they're seeing this, and that just had to have been so wild. But it's just weird. It's just weird because there were just all these like normal posts mixed in with all these darker posts. And I guess that's normal for like a darker 17-year-old, but it just had to be very jarring to look at in this context, especially because I think it was the day after the murders. Also, he had posted a photo of himself like in a pool, just like so normal, saying that swimming was like one of the few things that could keep him down. And it's just like, it's hard for there to be such a disconnect. And we see this, we know that is a thing, but it's just like it's just jarring. It's jarring to me. Anyways, there is more to him. There is a lot more to him, and more to his childhood in particular and his mental health that we are going to get into a little bit later. I want to talk about the investigation a little bit more, but I wanted to show you like the clear disconnect in this person and like what he must have been experiencing to post things like that after doing what he did, because spoiler alert, like Jeff did it. So anyways, I mentioned he had a girlfriend, and it matters because of this next part and also a little bit later, some more parts, but this in particular. So once they realized that Jeff was who they were looking for, as I said, they put him under surveillance. They put his vehicle under surveillance, and they actually found it, and they found that it was parked at his girlfriend's house. Eventually, though, Jeff left his girlfriend's house and drove over to Quick Trip on Woodstock Road in Cobb County, and it was there the police actually arrested him without incident. Oh, it was without incident, but it was eventful. When he was arrested and he was put into the backseat of the police car, there's like a camera in there, and they caught on camera him like clearly in the midst of a mental health crisis or incredible acting, because he was having an argument basically with himself, but it seemed like he was talking to another person, going back and forth, having this argument, telling this person to like stay away from him and to stay away from his wife. So that is a bit odd. It's something to note for sure. But either way, he was arrested without incident, which is good. Nobody else got hurt here. And he was charged with 15 different counts, which included murder, felony murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, kidnapping, aggravated sexual battery, financial transaction card theft, identity fraud, theft by taking and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Now, once Jeff was arrested, which was super quick, by the way, I know I kept saying things were happening quickly, but they did, because literally 48 hours after the murders, Jeff was already in custody. And once he was arrested, they were able to search his car and they found all kinds of stuff. They found a small gas can and they found 2 long guns. They also found the mask, the same V for Vendetta mask that he had been wearing at the time that the crimes were committed. That was in his car. And they also found shell casings inside the car for a 9mm Sig Sauer firearm. Sig Sauer. I don't know guns, but it's like a semi-automatic pistol, basically. They were also able to get a search warrant for Jeff's grandparents' house, which is where he had been living for years, but had recently been kicked out of. And when police got to his grandparents' house and they were led to his bedroom, I guess they told him that his room was always locked with a deadbolt and that Jeff had told them, like, never to enter his room under any circumstance. So that must have made them feel like they were really going to be walking into something. But they were and they weren't, because inside the home, they collected a ton of evidence like, quote, bodily fluids, blood, trace and DNA evidence, firearms, ammunition, shell casings. I went real Georgia there. Clothing with blood, electronic devices, or financial transaction cards in names other than Jeffrey or Jeffrey Andrew Hazelwood. So it sounds like he had other people's cards. And they didn't clarify that these were Natalie's or these were Carter's, but I mean, it seems like it's possible that they were, since we know hers was taken and we know they found somebody's card that wasn't his in his room. They also collected black jackets, electronic tablets, an iPad, a pair of boots, boxer shorts, and notepads with Jeff's writing, because apparently he really liked to write. This was something he did quite a bit, which was, helpful in looking into his mindset, because he had different writings where he wrote about him being, quote, schizo, and he also wrote about wanting to be an assassin and wrote about the specific steps he would take towards accomplishing that goal. Anyways, Jeff was taken to the station to be questioned, and he was questioned twice. And both times he was Mirandized. They did the whole thing. Everything that needed to be done was done. And though Jeff did seem to be going through a mental health crisis, because he was able to show to police that he at least understood what was going on enough to be questioned. Like, he was asked if he knew what a lawyer was, because he was waiving his rights and agreeing to talk. And he said, one of those people he would see in court on TV. So with that, they proceeded. Now, he was an intense interviewee, interrogation-y. He was very, very anxiety-ridden. You could see it in his body. I watched the interrogation footage. You could see that he was very, very stressed out, particularly when distressing subjects were brought up. And the officer, the lady who was interviewing him, said of his behavior and his demeanor, quote, he shook his hand during part of the interview. When I confronted him on some tough subjects, he used a British accent and a very whiny type of voice to speak back to me, which I can confirm it was quite whiny. Anyways, he had a lot of outward physical signs of the anxiety that he seemed to be exhibiting, and feeling inside, his hand ticks. His hands were shaking like crazy, very, very intensely. When the officer first came in to try to question him, she realized I need to calm him down so I can even make this successful in any way. So she spoke to him very calmly to try to calm down the agitation that he was feeling. He starts telling officers his, life story, right? He tells them that he had lived with his grandparents until he had gotten kicked out on the first. He said, the first was the night of the murders. He said that he had been at his girlfriend's house, and that after he had left his girlfriend's house, he had sort of driven around a while, looked around for a place to sleep. And then he kind of deviates from his story and he's like, but something really weird happened. And the officer's like, what's that weird thing? And he said that even though he didn't like them, he had found a gun that night. That particular night, he had found a gun behind a gas station, which we know wasn't true because we already know that 12 hours after the murders, Jeff's grandpa, Walter, had called and reported that a gun had been stolen. So we know that the gun Jeff had that night was his grandfather's gun. But this is what he was telling police initially. He was then asked about the murders. The investigator didn't seem like she was being careful with him, but she didn't seem like she was going easy on him, right? She lowballed him. Little easy question. Okay, so now let's talk about the murders, okay? And he said that he had heard about them, from his girlfriend's mom, and that they were just horrible, absolutely awful, which the audacity is what I'll say to that. And the officer's like, oh, so you heard about them from the mom and it's awful. Okay, but here's the thing. We have you on video. getting to the Publix, getting out of your car and walking to the area where the murders happened around the exact same time that the murders were being committed. So do you have an explanation for that? And it's at this point that he started aggressively shaking again. Like all the work she had done to calm him down was gone. And he said that he didn't want to say anything because it was just so awful. He said that there was blood everywhere. He said he saw blood everywhere. He said it was very dark and very bad and that he didn't do it. And he seemed very confused and very anxious when he was talking during this time. Now, shortly after this, his first interview just stopped. Like the interview was done. He had closed in on himself. They weren't getting any more information out of him. But he would be questioned again. He would actually voluntarily be questioned again, and they would get more out of him. But in the meantime, they were going to question his girlfriend / spiritual wife. And even though she is an adult, or she was an adult at that time, her mother was there with her when she was being questioned because apparently she's hard at hearing and also is subject to seizures. So she does later ask her mom to leave once the question gets a little more intense because she doesn't want her mom. Her mom kind of was like pushing her to answer, but also talking over her a little bit. So I think she was just like, can you leave? Which pissed her mom off. I'll tell you that. Her mom was like, well, that makes me mad. But she asked her mom to leave and then she was questioned by herself. She tells the police about their relationship, about how they met. She said the two met because they both worked at Michael's. They worked at two separate stores and that they had met and just had recently started dating. They had only been dating like 5 months. But despite this, despite not being together that long, she was able to give them some insight into him and his beliefs and his mental state. She said that he believed in spirit animals and that he himself had 2 animals inside of him, a hawk and a wolf. And she said that he believed that hawks were protecting him. She also told police that he had been going through a particularly rough time recently and had even tried to take his own life. She said he had taken a bunch of pills and that she had found him and that she had revived him 3 different times, which is like a lot for anybody to go through. I can't imagine what that's like, but I guess she didn't even call the cops and she didn't call an ambulance because she said that he hated hospitals and that she was like going to nursing school, I guess, or like was a nursing major. So she figured she could handle it, even though after this OD, this attempt on his life, he couldn't remember things for like a week after. Now, the interrogator is very hard on her. It's actually sad. I didn't really like it. I felt like he was rude to her, but I also think that he believed that she knew more than she did. Not that she was involved, but that she knew more, even though I don't really think that she did, to be honest. But she was, it sucks, during the interrogation, she was able to put 2 and 2 together and figure out what he was questioning her about, because like the area wasn't super big and only one huge murder had happened in the area recently. And police had asked her about like weapons and guns and stuff. So she was able to put 2 and 2 together and was like, well, is this about the murders? And the cop's like, oh my gosh, how do you know about that? Like, you must know something. He must have told you something if you think that's what I'm questioning you about. But she really didn't seem to know anything. Not that he had done something like this, not that he could do something like this. She said the only thing she knew is that he felt one coming on, which she described as being one of his episodes. She said that he had had a knife and he said that he felt like he was going to hurt someone. So she just took the knife. And then she told police that like he does struggle from mental health issues. She tells the officer like Jeff has schizophrenia, but that she truly deep down didn't believe that he would ever hurt anybody. It was just that the voices in his head made him want to. And then she does let police know that he is supposed to take medication, but recently he had stopped. And this matters, and this will come up at his trial, as I'm sure you can imagine. So that's why it's incredibly relevant, and talking about her and her interview is relevant here. Now, let's get back to Jeff and his second interview. So he actually ended up having a second interview because he requested to speak to the officer again. And he does eventually in the second interview confess, but he starts by distancing himself and just saying that he was there, not that he did it. He claimed that that night he was actually with a man named Matt, that Matt was the aggressor. Matt was the one who made him do what he did because he felt like he needed to protect his family. He needed to protect his wife, which is the girlfriend we already talked about, and her family, because he considered them to be his family. It's very confusing because he wasn't, there's clearly something going on. So he says that he left his girlfriend's house and he met up with Matt. And he says that he met up with him, but he also says that he went to meet him specifically, but it is very unclear because his mind seemed to be very confused when he was telling this story. But Either way, he says he ends up picking up this Matt person and that they're driving along, and Matt just says he needs a ride to go see this girl that he really loves, and that everything was, kind of normal, but that the vibes seemed to change, that this guy ended up getting Jeff's ID and telling him like, oh, well, now I have your name, and then threatening him and telling him he needed to do everything that he said, that Jeff needed to do everything Matt said, or he was going to hurt him. He was going to hurt his family. Okay? This is his story. He says he eventually made it to Publix, that that's where the two were driving, and that's where he saw Natalie and Carter, and that Matt told him he was going to need to kill that girl and that boy, otherwise Matt was going to kill him and kill his family. So he did what he was told because he was scared. He said he didn't want to do this. He didn't want to kill these kids. He didn't want to hurt them. He said initially he just hit Carter, hoping that this would satiate this Matt person, but that it wouldn't. He's like, no, you have to kill him. You have to kill them. He said that he saw the bodies fall and that the girl wasn't wearing any clothes. And his story was just incredibly jumbled. And as he told it, he started saying I instead of just Matt. He started saying I. And that's because Matt was not real. Police had already looked at the surveillance footage and they had already seen that there was nobody there with Jeff. Matt was just in his imagination. So what really happened that night is that Jeff had been at his girlfriend's house and had left his girlfriend's house, had driven around for a while, and finally ended up at Publix, probably looking for a place to sleep because he had just been kicked out of his house. It was while he was there that he saw Natalie and Carter, who I believe, based on what I've read, were exes. They were just young kids. I think they had dated. It was kind of unclear online, but I did see it described as romantic, and I also saw it described as exes. They had snuck out of their houses to meet at Publix to be together. So when the two got there to Publix, they drove to the back of the store in their cars, and Jeff said that he had seen them get there, and he had seen the cars drive to the back, and he was curious why they were going back there. So he got out of his car and he followed them. And this was confirmed to be true by video surveillance. On camera, you see two cars pulling behind the building, going out of range of the cameras, and then a minute later, a young man entering the frame on foot and walking out of the frame as well. Then 20 minutes later, you see him sprinting from the area. About an hour later, about an hour after all of that happened, you see Jeff come back wearing that mask. He runs into frame and he actually goes, and that's when he takes the jumper cables out of Carter's car. As I told you, they were stolen, but they weren't super important to the investigation. His story just confirmed it. And he took these jumper cables because he was worried his car would break down. But anyways, after following Natalie and Carter to the back of Publix, he says that he hid behind an electrical box and just watched them for a while to see what was going on. He said eventually he ended up climbing onto the roof of Publix to get a better view of Natalie and Carter because they were now in the backseat of her car. And he said that he's got onto the roof by scaling the wall like Spider-Man. Jeff said he spied on the couple for some time before eventually grabbing the gun that he had stolen from his grandfather's vehicle and approaching Natalie's car. Jeff says he went over to the car, he showed them the gun, and he told them to get out of the car. He said as Carter was getting out of the car, he hit him with the gun, which caused the gun to go off apparently, and one shot was fired into the ground. Jeff said that Carter was then pissed and he was yelling at him. He was cussing at him and pissed off because, hello, you've come to them while they're in this car in the middle of the night and you pulled a gun on them. And Jeff said that when Carter started yelling at him, he got scared. That Jeff got scared of this kid who's just freaking out because he has a gun pulled on him in the middle of the night. A gun that, Jeff, you are holding. And he said because he was scared, he shot Carter in the head, killing him right there in front of Natalie. And I cannot even imagine the fear that this girl felt, the fear that both of these kids felt. He then ordered Natalie to get out of the car, and she was only partially dressed at this point. She was wearing a t-shirt and underwear. And so he said when she got out of the car, he ordered her to take off the rest of her clothes. He then bent her over the hood of the car and he spanked her before he says he sexually assaulted her with his hand. Though I just hope that this isn't true. I know that the autopsy didn't show any sign of sexual assault or anything like that, but I don't know if that act would have shown, and I just hope that it's not true. But this is what he says happened, and he says that when he was done, he shot her in the head too, killing her, and that she fell on the ground next to the car. It's just so scary because Jeff didn't know these kids at all. They had done nothing. There was no motive at all for him murdering them, but he did. And then afterwards, he posed their bodies in the way that police found them. So horrible. And, he was arrested. He was in jail, and he was being held without bond. Now, during the court proceedings, he refused to look at Carter and Natalie's families. And it seemed clear that he was going through something still. Like, he was handcuffed, but his hands were shaking, and he was like looking all over the room super fast from like one spot to the next. And another thing that was weird and noted is that he appeared to be like petting an invisible dog, and that he was wearing a wedding ring, though he had never been married. And you remember, he kept referring to his wife. But for clarity, because I was like, when I first read the reporting, I was like, he didn't have a wife. That's so weird. But he was referring to his girlfriend. Apparently, he said that they weren't legally married, but that they were married like by their religion. They considered each other husband and wife, which I guess is why he wore the ring. And he said that in their minds, they had been married since April 22nd. And she seemed incredibly important to him. She did. She seemed like this was the one relationship that he could rely on and that was solid to him. And that's why he clung to it so hard. And it was so important in his mind. So all of this erratic behavior seemed very intense, and to some it seemed like he may have been acting. But one of his people he knew, one of his friends, did give an interview with Crime Watch Daily saying that though this may seem like an act, it wasn't. This really was how Jeff was. And this friend also said that those who knew Jeff were not that surprised to hear something like this happen, because they knew he was a ticking time bomb who would end up either in jail or prematurely killed. Like, they were like, he's destined for trouble. But anyways, he came to court. He entered his plea. He was there a grand total of 3 minutes, just long enough to enter his plea of not guilty and be ushered out. And as I'm sure you can imagine with everything I said, Jeff's mental health and his childhood, all of that was going to play hugely into the trial and what people were going to be discussing. So with that, let's talk about Jeff. Let's talk about what happened to him. Jeffrey Hazelwood, who turned 20 just 3 weeks before the murders, was born on July 10th, 1996, to his mother, Sherry, who was just 19 years old, which is hard, but it is doable. We see young mothers killing it every single time. Well, not every single time, but we see every day that young mothers are capable, even though it's difficult, of getting shit done. But that didn't seem to be Sherry's mindset when having her son. Sherry just seemed to have a lot of her own things to work through, from her and Jeff's father separating when he was just a baby, like right when he was born. The dad dipped, to, well, I don't know if he dipped or she asked him to kindly leave, but he wasn't in the picture, to her dealing with her own substance abuse issues with drugs and alcohol. And she just exposed Jeff to like an ideal start to life, right? He saw a lot of horrible things. He was exposed to a lot of random men that she would bring in and out of the house. He was just exposed to all the types of things you wouldn't want a young baby exposed to. She was literally referred as a, quote, remarkably poor parent who didn't give Jeff a fighting chance. Now, Jeff's maternal grandparents saw this. They saw the condition that Jeff was being raised in. They saw the situation. They were like, this is not going to happen. So they actually got an attorney and they sued for custody of Jeff. And when he was just 18 months old, he was taken and he was able to live with his grandparents. This was Walter and Marcia in their ranch-style home in Roswell. Now, his grandparents reportedly did the best they could, but it doesn't seem like he got all that he needed, all the treatment he needed for the trauma that he endured at the hands of his mother, because it's not like the relationship was completely done. They still had a relationship. It was just described as horrible. Just 10 days after his 9th birthday, his mother, Sherry Hicks now, her name was now Sherry Hicks, she was informed. She was told that she had to do intensive counseling. It would be twice a month with her and Jeff together, and once a month just her by herself. And this is something she needed to do so that she could learn how to be a parent to a child with intensive behavioral issues, because the goal was that eventually they could be a family again. Now, I don't know how receptive she was to this. I don't know if she did what she needed to do for her son. She hasn't given any statements. The only thing I could see that could be indicative of whether or not she was interested in helping, which isn't necessarily true because finances don't have everything to do with how good of a parent you are, but I know she was ordered to pay $40 a week for Jeff, and that she didn't, and that her parents ended up like her parents, so the grandparents that had Jeff, ended up being owed like $12,000 before finally they sued her for this money because she just wasn't paying the $40 a week. And all of this, despite his grandparents trying to get him all the help they could get, he did still seem to struggle and had serious behavioral issues. And over the years, I think from 2010 to 2016, the cops were called on him almost 10 times. In one call when he was just 13 years old, the cops were alerted to come to the house because he was said to be standing in the front yard waving a gun. But luckily when they got there, they found it was just a toy gun. So they told him, like, don't do that, young man, and went on their way. In 2011, the cops were called again, and Jeff was reported missing after he left his grandparents' house and left a note saying that he wanted to go out into the wilderness and see how long he could survive. Now, this was alarming to his grandparents because the 14-year-old Jeff didn't take any camping gear, didn't take a backpack, but he did take his grandfather's gun. Luckily, though, everything was okay. Later that night, he was able to be found. Like, he actually called his grandparents and told them that he was just at his mother's house in Woodstock, and she ended up driving him home. But again, he wasn't following their rules. He dipped. He took the gun. I can't breathe. It's just concerning. And it's worth mentioning that all of this stuff that's happening, that's happening, and they're seeing behavioral issues at home with him, and they're seeing his temperament every day. So everything that might sound kind of benign to us isn't through the lens of people who are with him every day. In another instance, neighbors called the police on Jeff when he was seen in the front yard swinging a sword around and throwing knives. The neighbors, I guess, that saw this were concerned at the 15-year-old who had these weapons because, one, he's throwing weapons around and that's dangerous, and two, they had interactions with Jeff, so they knew that he was a bit of a strange kid. So the cops came and he told them that he was just practicing karate. So they just told him, like, okay, don't do that and don't trespass on your neighbor's yards, like in their lawns. Stay in your own property, basically. Now, the worst call came later in April of 2013 when his grandma called police because he had taken knives and a sword from their gun safe, and this scared her because about 6 weeks before that call, the then 16-year-old Jeff had come to her and he told her he was going to blow and that people were going to get hurt, but he didn't know when and he didn't have a plan. So the cops came. He was questioned and he just said that, it was just thoughts he had and that he wasn't going to hurt anyone and he wasn't going to hurt himself. It was just stuff that he had thought about from time to time, but he didn't have a real plan to do it. Less than 2 years later, in February of 2015, Walter, Jeff's grandpa, called the cops and reported that one of his guns, one of his rifles, had been stolen. And Jeff was a suspect, but no charges were brought up at that time. So there were many calls against Jeff, many instances when the police were there, but there were never any convictions. He was never arrested, which in hindsight does seem like an issue, but at the same time, the cops are like, listen, we can't just put somebody in a hospital because he seems odd if he's not doing anything dangerous. So he had a lot going on. And people noticed it. His family noticed it. His aunt said, like, he had a lot of hurt or anger inside of him, but nobody could say what that was about. Only Jeff knew. Neighbors noticed it. Friends noticed it. Kids at school, they noticed that there was something about him that was just off. Jeff had gone to both the Compass Academy, an alternative school that allowed students to attend just 3 days a week, and then the Alternative Youth Academy, a military-style school. And a former classmate said that Jeff just didn't seem normal. You could feel that there was something different whenever you were around him, whenever you stood beside him. And then towards the end, his grandparents who had tried so hard with him had just had enough. Like, they were afraid of him. They were afraid he was stealing weapons. He was expressing both suicidal and homicidal thoughts. So they asked him to move out. They asked him to leave. And so for a bit, he was just kind of bouncing around, staying on friends and family members' couches and sometimes sleeping in his car. Now, why was Jeff's behavior so erratic? Well, it seems like it was a combination of mental health issues and trauma, because we've already discussed the trauma, but he was also diagnosed with schizophrenia, autism, and bipolar disorder. Now, this was an issue at trial, the fact that he had these mental health issues, because apparently when he was first arrested, he wasn't given his medication even in jail. He went like a month without receiving it, but eventually he did start taking it, which was good because I guess when he first because he got arrested and he got sent to a hospital. And when he was first sent to the hospital, he was said to be in like awful shape. They said he was incoherent, he was like hearing voices, and he had trouble even forming sentences. The psychologist who had been treating Jeff before he got arrested, I guess he treated him for 3 years and there had been over 82 sessions, said that Jeff really suffered from hallucinations. He would hear voices, sometimes they were friends, but sometimes he thought he was hearing the thoughts of demons. And he also had the belief that sometimes God would like send him messages through the TV. And he felt that sometimes people were watching him through the walls, that there were cameras in his room. And he also suffered from depressed mood. I don't know why that was so hard to say. Difficulty sustaining attention and like hard, I can't pay attention. apparently same. And also he had a lot of trouble sleeping, which doesn't help when you're already struggling mentally at all. So he had been on medication for these issues for years, but reportedly he had told his girlfriend, and he himself admitted, that shortly before the murders, he had stopped taking his medication. Now, Jeff's previous doctor was put on the stand because he was going to be questioned by both the prosecution and the defense with their, separate goals in mind. One of them, the prosecution, wanting to prove that his mental health did not play into the fact that the murders were committed, and the defense, of course, wanting to say that his mental health issues played heavily into why these murders were committed, and the defense was even trying to say that he wasn't competent to stand trial. But he would eventually be found competent. He received treatment after he was arrested at the Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, I hope, after he was arrested, and the doctor he was given at the time said that he had shown great progress since arriving at the hospital. He initially said that Jeff was suffering from psychosis, but they were having trouble pinpointing his exact diagnosis. They knew all of his prior diagnoses, all the stuff that he had been diagnosed with prior to being arrested, but they wanted to, have their own opinion because everything is very subjective, and they were having trouble nailing that down. He did eventually confirm that Jeff did suffer from 5 different mental health disorders, and that these caused hallucinations, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. But with treatment and medication, he was competent to stand trial and understood, how court proceedings worked, etc., etc. Now, this definitely mattered. I think it did matter, but in terms of the legalese of it all, it didn't end up mattering as much because Jeff, though he had pled not guilty initially, he ended up changing his plea, and he changed it to guilty but insane. Jeff was led into the courtroom, and he seemed a lot more even during this time. He wasn't shaking. He was wearing this gray suit, and his long hair was cut short, and he didn't say much, right? He just said yes, ma'am, when answering questions, whether or not he understood the charges against him, whether or not he understood the amount of time he was going to get for these charges, and if he had taken his medication the night before and that morning, because those are all very important when he's literally agreeing to something that is going to change his life forever. But he said he did, and he was pleading guilty to a lot of charges. He was pleading guilty to 2 counts of malice murder, 3 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault, 1 count of kidnapping, 1 count of aggravated sexual battery, 1 count of finance credit card theft, 1 count of identity fraud, 2 counts of possession of a firearm during a felony, and 1 count of theft by taking, all related to the murders of Natalie and Carter. Before his sentence was read, the court, Jeff, they all heard victim impact statements from the people who cared most about Carter and Natalie. And we will start here with what Natalie's mother said in part. She said of her daughter, quote, "She will never graduate from high school. She will never experience college. She will never get to fulfill her dream of becoming an architect. Natalie will never experience the incredible joy and love of having children of her own. She will never get the chance to change the world for the better. As her family, we will never again hear her beautiful singing or hear her playing her guitar around the house. We'll never be able to hear infectious belly laugh or hug her tightly just as she did with us. Her daddy will never be able to give away her hand in marriage. No more opportunities to tell her how much we love her. No more trips as a family with her. Everything has changed." Next, Carter's mother gave a victim impact statement where she talked about losing her baby boy, where she said in part, quote, "What could he have become? What impact would he have made? How can I give words to the impact of losing a talented and smart young man, one who cared about a world and how we treat it? I think to Carter's great humble gift of caring for those who were picked on, had trouble in school, or was left out. He stood up to his friends and aggressors, never backing down but protecting, helping others treated unfairly. He helped kids do homework, make friends, and feel included. How can I say the impact that losing this voice, this kind of good and kind character is on our world? I can't." Which that broke my heart, dude. Victim impact statements always break my heart. And then the judge continued to break my heart even further, saying that he had been doing this a very long time, but there were only 2 or 3 cases that hit his heart as much as Natalie and Carter's did. And he said that the family's composure and their poise in handling the murders of their children were amazing to see. And then he said to the family, quote, the families, quote, "Mrs. Henderson, you said Natalie would never change the world. She already has. This case will have a lasting impact on many, many different issues and causes. It may not have been the way she wanted to impact the world or the way y'all thought she would impact the world, but she has. And she's impacted every person that's been in this courtroom from the very first day that I handled this case. And she will continue to impact the world. I truly wish from the bottom of my heart it was a different way, but she has. To the Davis family, you indicated you found some light. Carter will continue to bring light. And just like Natalie has made a lasting impact on the folks in this courtroom, obviously on y'all's lives, but also sometimes on a failing system. And they will remain the inspiration, at least to this single judge, to do what she can to make sure these things don't happen in the future. I can't fix it. I can't pretend to understand it. And I can't imagine what you are going through. And you have my sincere prayers and condolences. That literally made me want to cry. And I think I said before that the judge was a dude, but I think that it was a lady based on her statement. I spaced a little there. Oh God. But I guess it's just so sad. And Jeff, despite doing this, he didn't apologize himself. His attorney did apologize for him and his grandparents. His attorney said that he was remorseful, that at the time of the murders, he was struggling from visual and auditory hallucinations, but he was remorseful. And his grandparents said that they are just completely brokenhearted for Carter and Natalie's families and that they feel like their hearts have been ripped out. I can't imagine the guilt that they feel. And I'm not saying they should, but I can understand why they would, because they just asked him to leave. But they couldn't have anticipated, right, that he'd do something this horrible. Who could? Honestly, who could? So with that, in March of 2017, Jeffrey Hazelwood was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. But because he pled guilty but insane, he will receive psychiatric care while in jail for as long as he needs it, which is probably the way these situations should be handled, because just because you were mentally unwell when you did something doesn't mean that you're not accountable for doing it. And that's tricky. It's very, very tricky, but it's like, can you really just let somebody out? We've seen that happen, and we've seen how that doesn't seem like justice. It seems like a very difficult thing that there's not a right answer to. But with that, he is staying in Baldwin State Prison, last I saw, in Midgeville. It's a city that I can't name cities if they're not from California, and sometimes even then. And it's been uneventful since he's been sent there, mostly. And I say mostly because I guess in August of 2017, so just months after he was sentenced and sent to jail, he actually somehow got access to a cell phone and posted a selfie of himself from prison. He literally took a selfie and posted it on social media. I believe it was on Instagram stories. It's just like him sitting up against a brick wall, like in a prison shirt. It's just like his face with no words, no context, nothing. And I guess a mom of a girl who Jeff knew before he went to jail, said that he was also messaging her daughter on Facebook. The jail's response was just like, I don't know what happened. I don't know how he got this, but apparently, and I didn't know this, contraband cell phones are a humongous problem all over the country, not even just Georgia. It's like a huge nationwide issue. Apparently there was this former prison guard, to illustrate this further, there's this former prison guard in South Carolina, and he came out after this saying he has a huge issue with contraband cell phones being in prisons, because in 2010 he had been a prison guard and he had confiscated a contraband package from a gang leader in jail. And this guy was able to get a cell phone and was able to use that phone to pay a hitman $6,000, okay, through the phone and a green dot card, to go to this correctional officer's house and try to kill him. So he did. The hitman went to his house, knocked on his door, and shot him over and over. I think he shot him 6 times. And he said he died twice on the operating table, but was just too stubborn to stay gone. So, though it seems small, Jeff having a cell phone in jail and taking a selfie, overall, this is a much more serious problem. I did not realize. It's just damn, I cannot even imagine. That's crazy. But, I just wanted to tell you this because even though it's not relevant in this case, because all he did was take a selfie, it does seem to be a larger separate issue. This case is just so tragic. The fact that something like this could happen to these 2 sweet kids. And it does seem like Jeff is insane. Or, that he does suffer from the ruling, the guilty but insane makes sense here to me. And I do think it probably played a role in what happened to Natalie and Carter. And that seems like an incredibly difficult thing to grapple with, especially for their families. It's this horrible thing happened, but the person who did it wasn't really there, wasn't really mentally present when they did it. And that just seems hard. It seems very, very difficult to deal with, but I do think he is where he should be. I think that makes sense because I think two things can be true at the same time. I think he could have been sick, and I think he still needs to be held accountable because he took these two young kids' lives. At the end of the day, that's the truth. They're gone forever, and that's because of something he did. And I don't know. It just seems like a solutionless problem, and that is part of why this is so scary. But with that, my friends, is the story of the murders of Natalie Henderson and Carter Davis. I hope that you found it informative. I hope I gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, I just want to thank you for remembering Natalie and Carter with me today. Now, considering everything I told you throughout this video, I want to revisit the question of the day, and that was this. What do you think could have been done to prevent this? I saw this article of this guy saying that what should happen in cases like this, it was like some, professional saying in cases like this, what should happen is that a child who grows up in the type of home that Jeff was in should be flagged and be given like mandatory therapy. And I don't know if that's the solution. I don't know the ethics involved in that. So let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, because we're open to suggestions here. We obviously don't know what the fuck to do. But anyways, guys, before you leave, please don't forget to leave me a comment down below with whatever case you'd like to see me cover in the future. As you know, I have a long list of cases, and whenever you leave me a suggestion, I put your name next to it. So if I cover it, I can give you a shout out. I love looking into the cases you guys suggest because they're often cases I haven't heard of or cases that need more coverage. And I know you're filled with great ideas and great taste. Otherwise, you would not be here. If you haven't already, please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing the bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below, along with a link to my membership and a link to my merch store. And now with all that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday. And I hope to see you in my next video.